The cobblestones slicked with a grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove, reflecting the sickly yellow of the gas lamps above. Elias Thorne pulled his collar tight against the damp, the wool scratching his jaw like a coarse beard. Dawn remained an hour off, a distant promise swallowed by the smog that hugged the river and climbed the hills from Pimlico to Holborn. His right hand rested inside his coat pocket, fingers tracing the embossed leather of the notebook buried beneath his handkerchief and tobacco tin. Not the official log, the other one, the black book with the broken clasp. He walked onwards through the empty streets. Boots struck stone in a rhythm that matched the ticking of the watch in his waistcoat, a mechanical heartbeat counting down to the opening of the doors. The city slept, or pretended to. Shutters remained drawn against the chill, and the only movement came from stray dogs picking through the rubbish piled near the gutters. A cart rumbled past, iron rims grinding on the sets, the driver hunched over the reins like a gargoyle carved from shadow. Elias stepped aside into the recess of a doorway, pressing his back against the cold brick until the wheels passed. The smell of horse manure and wet ash filled his nose, thick and cloying. He adjusted the pocket again, feeling the notebook shift, heavy as a pistol. Inside those pages, he would not write what the court required. No formal headings, no verified timestamps, no sanitized summaries for the press. He would write the tremor in a witness's voice, the way Sir Edward Clarke's eyes narrowed when a lie suited his purpose, the specific chemical scent of fear that rose from the dock when the name of chloroform was spoken. It was a dangerous thing to carry, this second record. If Silas Thorne found it, Elias would be out on the street before the lunch hour, his reputation shredded like old briefs. But the official transcript was a skeleton without flesh. It captured the words, not the truth. A constable stood near the entrance of the Old Bailey, lantern light swinging gently from his gloved hand. The beam cut through the fog, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air before settling on Elias' face. The officer straightened, shifting the weight of his truncheon. "Early abroad, Mr. Thorne," the constable said, voice rough with sleep and tobacco. "Or did you never leave?" "The law sleeps poorly, constable," Elias replied, stopping before the heavy oak doors. He drew his hand from his pocket, leaving the notebook buried. "And justice wakes with a headache." The constable chuckled, a dry sound like paper crumpling, before he stepped aside with the key already in hand. "They're saying she did it with a handkerchief. The whole city's talking," he added, reckoning it's witchcraft. "Chemistry, not witchcraft." "Same thing to the folks in the gallery. They want blood." As the constable pushed the door open, the hinges groaned, a low complaint that echoed into the dark vestibule. "You be careful in there, air's thick enough to chew." Elias nodded, stepping over the threshold. The warmth of the building hit him first, carrying the scent of stale tobacco, damp wool, and the distinct metallic tang of old ink. He paused in the foyer, letting his eyes adjust to the gloom. The gas jets hissed softly against the glass globes, casting long, wavering shadows across the tiled floor. Upstairs, court number 1 waited. The wood would be cold to the touch. The benches would creak under the weight of the spectators. And Mrs. Bartlett would sit in the dock, still as a portrait, while men shouted about her soul. He climbed the stairs, feeling each step deliberate. It was an ascent towards a judgment he had no part in delivering, yet was tasked with preserving. His hand returned to his pocket, thumb rubbing the corner of the black book. He thought of Thomas Bartlett, dead in his bed without a mark on his skin, a murder invisible to the eye. How does one transcribe a vapor? How does one capture the absence of a bruise? The official record would state the facts. Chloroform found in the stomach. Cause of death established. Verdict rendered. But the black book would hold the doubt. The way the defense counsels smiled when the prosecution stumbled. The way the judge looked away when the medical testimony turned to speculation. At the landing, he stopped. The door to the courtroom stood closed, a barrier between the silence of the corridor and the roar of the proceeding. He could hear murmurs from inside, the shuffling of papers, the clearing of throats. The machine was already warming up. He took a breath, the air tasting of dust and expectation. If he wrote the truth, he risked his livelihood. If he wrote only the record, he risked his conscience. Elias turned the handle. The latch clicked, loud in the quiet hall. He pushed the door open and stepped into the light. Light flooded the room, harsh and yellow, stripping the shadows from the corners where the night's dust had settled. The courtroom stretched away from him, a cavernous throats of brick and dark oak ready to swallow the words he would soon catch. Gas jets hissed softly against the glass globes above, a sound like snakes waking in dry grass, casting long wavering shadows across the tiled floor that danced with every draft from the ventilation shafts. Elias moved to the side, keeping his shoulder near the wall, and slid beneath the clerk's table where the air hung still and thick with the scent of stale ink. This was his burrow. He unpacked his tools with practiced economy, laying out the nibs in a row like surgical instruments on a velvet cloth. The wood beneath his knees was cold, seeping through the wool of his trousers, a reminder that the law offered no comfort to those who recorded its machinery. He dipped the pen, watching the black liquid cling to the metal, heavy and viscous. A single drop fell onto the blotter, spreading quickly into a dark stain that looked too much like a bruise. He wiped it away with his thumb, the ink staining the skin until it resembled a birthmark. Footsteps approached, slow and deliberate on the boards above his head. Elias did not look up. He knew the tread. Elias Thorne walked as if he owned the floorboards, each step a claim of tenure. The chief clerk stopped directly above the alcove, the hem of his frock coat visible through the gap in the table legs. Dust motes danced around the fabric, disturbed by the movement. Elias cleared his throat, a dry rattle that echoed in the confined space beneath the table. "Your position is cramped, Mr. Thorne," Elias said, voice dropping low so it would not carry to the empty benches. "But it is necessary. The gallery must not see the sweat on your brow." "The view is sufficient, Mr. Thorne," Elias replied while testing the nib on the paper. It scratched, a harsh friction that set his teeth on edge. "I hear what I need to hear." Hearing is one matter, recording is another. Elias crouched, bringing his face level with the opening of the alcove. His eyes were pale, watery, framed by deep lines that spoke of too many hours squinting at ledgers in poor light. He smelled of peppermint and old paper, a scent that clung to the court itself. "Do not mistake the scratch of your nib for the voice of conscience, Elias. The law cares only for what is spoken aloud, not what is whispered in the margins." Elias paused, the pen hovering over the page. The ink gathered at the tip, trembling, ready to fall. "I transcribe the evidence," Elias said, "nothing more." "Ensure it remains so." Elias reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the official logbook. His nails were clean, manicured, untouched by manual labor. "There are matters of science in this case that confuse the jury. Confusion leads to doubt. Doubt leads to acquittal. We cannot have the reputation of the Central Criminal Court tarnished by speculation regarding vapors and handkerchiefs. The evidence is the evidence. The evidence is what remains on the page when the session ends." Elias straightened, his joints clicking audibly in the quiet room. He adjusted his waistcoat, pulling the fabric taut over his stomach. "There will be physicians speaking today, men of learning. They will use terms you do not understand. Write the words, not the meaning. Let the judges decide the meaning. And if the words imply a lie." Elias looked down at him, his expression unreadable and mask-like before he spoke. "Then you have done your duty. Truth," he said, "is a luxury for philosophers. We are mechanics of the record." He turned away, the coat tails swishing as he walked towards the judge's bench. Elias watched him go, the tension in his shoulders tightening until it felt like a wire pulled taut beneath the skin. He reached into his pocket, his fingers finding the leather of the black book. It was warm from his body heat, a secret pulse against his thigh. Elias wanted the skeleton. Elias intended to flesh it out, bone by bloody bone. He opened the official log. The pages were blank, waiting, innocent. He dipped the pen again. Room began to fill. It happened gradually, a seepage of humanity rather than a flood. Clerks took their seats at the long tables, arranging piles of briefs tied with red tape. Ushers in black coats moved along the rails, whispering to one another, checking the locks on the dock gate. The gallery above started to murmur, a low hum of anticipation that vibrated in the floorboards. Men in top hats leaned over the railing, seeking a glimpse of the woman who had supposedly killed her husband with chemistry. Women in bonnets sat rigid, faces pale with a mixture of horror and fascination. Elias adjusted his posture, straightening his spine against the hard wood of the table leg. The air grew heavier, charged with the static of impending conflict. He could smell the tobacco smoke drifting down from the gallery, mixing with the ozone scent of the gaslights. It created a haze that blurred the edges of the room, making the judge's high bench seem even more distant, like a fortress on a hill. Elias flexed his fingers, loosening the grip on the pen. He needed to be ready. The first words would come quickly, and he could not ask for repetition. A bell tolled somewhere in the building, deep and resonant. The murmuring ceased instantly. Elias Thorne stood by the judge's chair, hand resting on the leather upholstery, watching the door. The ushers straightened, hands clasped behind their backs. Elias held his breath, the pen poised above the paper, the ink dark and waiting. He thought of Thomas Bartlett, lying cold in the morgue, his stomach full of poison. He thought of the wife waiting in the wings, her hands clean, her soul perhaps stained. The door to the courtroom opened. Heavy hinges groaned, a sound that cut through the silence like a knife. The usher stepped forward, voice booming across the wood and brick. "All rise." Chairs scraped against the floor. The gallery surged to their feet. Elias rose with them, his knees cracking from the crouch, his eyes fixed on the entrance where the shadows parted. He did not look at the judge. He looked past the bench to the dock where the prisoner would stand. The space was empty for a heartbeat, a void waiting to be filled. Then she appeared. Copyright de Bartlett stepped into the light. She wore black silk that absorbed the gaslight, giving her no shine, no depth. Her face was pale, composed, devoid of the trembling fear the papers had promised. She walked to the dock rail and placed her hands upon it, fingers interlaced, still as a portrait. The gallery held its breath, a collective suspension of air that pressed against Elias' eardrums. He sat back down, the movement unnoticed in the shuffle of the court, and dipped his pen. He wrote the dates. He wrote the names. Then he looked up, and Mrs. Bartlett turned her head. Her eyes found his in the shadowed alcove, dark and unblinking. She did not look away. She did not plead. She stared with a chilling, empty recognition that suggested she knew exactly what the vapor did and what it cost to write it down. Elias lowered his gaze to the paper. The ink flowed. The nib scratched, a dry, rat-like sound against the grain of the official paper. Elias kept his head down, forcing the wrist to move in the rigid, mechanical rhythm sealers demanded, yet the eyes refused to obey. They dragged upward, past the stack of briefs tied in red tape, past the shoulder of the clerk beside him, to the figure standing in the dock. Mrs. Bartlett remained motionless. The black silk of her morning dress drank the light from the gas jets above, leaving her silhouette sharp and void of reflection, a cutout placed against the oak paneling of the court. She did not fidget. She did not glance at the public gallery where the men leaned forward, collars straining against necks, hungry for the spectacle of a widow who had dissolved her husband from the inside out. Silence in the Old Bailey was rarely empty. It possessed weight, a physical pressure that pushed against the eardrums, thick with the smell of unwashed wool and the sour tang of nervous sweat rising from the gallery. "Prisoner at the bar," the usher intoned, his voice flat, devoid of the drama the crowd coveted. Copyright de Blanche Bartlett." She inclined her head, a fraction of an inch, no more. Elias dipped the pen again, the inkwell trembling slightly as his hand hovered. He needed to capture the tremor in her voice if she spoke, the catch of breath that might betray a conscience straining against the ribcage, but she offered nothing. Her hands rested on the rail, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles showed white, stark against the dark fabric of her gloves, those gloves, leather, supple, expensive. They covered the hands that had supposedly held the handkerchief, the rag soaked in chloroform, the instrument of a death that left no mark upon the throat. A man in the front row of the gallery coughed, a wet, hacking sound that echoed too loudly in the stillness. Mrs. Bartlett did not flinch. Elias felt a bead of sweat trickle down his own spine, itching between the shoulder blades where his shirt stuck to the skin. The air in the alcove was stagnant, trapped beneath the clerk's table, smelling of old dust and the metallic tang of the ink. He looked at Elias Thorne, who stood by the judge's bench like a sentinel carved from stone, his face turned towards the entrance where the counsel would soon emerge. Elias had warned him. Write the words, not the meaning. But how could one separate the word from the thing it named? How could he transcribe chloroform without seeing the liquid clear and heavy, pooling in the bottom of a glass, waiting to be poured? The heavy oak door behind the bench swung open. Sir John Bridge entered, his robes sweeping the floor, followed by the prosecuting counsel, their faces set in the grim masks of men about to dissect a life. They took their seats, arranging papers, whispering instructions to junior clerks who scurried like beetles across the floorboards. The noise of preparation began to build, a low murmur of shuffling feet and rustling paper that signaled the end of the waiting. Elias tightened his grip on the pen. The wood felt smooth, worn down by the thumbs of 1,000 previous scribes who had sat in this same shadowed corner, recording sins they could not punish. Mr. Justice Hawkins presiding, sealers announced, though the title was unnecessary. The authority radiating from the high bench required no introduction. The judge settled into his chair, adjusting the wig that sat stiffly upon his head, and surveyed the room. His gaze swept over the gallery, lingering for a moment on the women in their bonnets, before settling on the dock. He looked at Mrs. Bartlett not with anger, nor with pity, but with a detached curiosity, as one might examine a specimen pinned to a board. "Proceed," the judge said. His voice was low, resonant, carrying easily to the furthest corner of the chamber without effort. Sir John Bridge rose. He was a large man, broad in the shoulder, and his presence seemed to shrink the space around him. He turned to face the jury, 12 men selected from the streets of London to decide the fate of the woman in black. They looked back at him, faces blank, waiting to be told what to think, what to feel, what version of the truth to accept. "My lord, gentlemen of the jury," Bridge began, his voice booming now, filling the vaulted ceiling, bouncing off the brickwork to return as a dull roar. "We are gathered here to inquire into the death of Thomas Edwin Bartlett, a man of substance and respectability, whose life was extinguished not by violence of the hand, but by the insidious agency of poison." Elias' hand moved. Poison. The word formed on the page, the loops of the P and the cross of the T looking fragile, inadequate to hold the horror of the act. "The evidence will show," Bridge continued, pacing slowly before the jury box, his hands gesturing to emphasize the gravity of his words, "that on the night of the 1st day of January, in the privacy of their own home on Lambeth Road, the prisoner administered a fatal dose of chloroform to her husband." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Chloroform. The sweet, cloying scent seemed to manifest in the room, overriding the smell of tobacco and dust, a ghost of the crime haunting the air. Elias could almost taste it, sharp and chemical on the back of his tongue, making his eyes water. He blinked, forcing the sensation away, focusing instead on the scratch of the nib, the rhythm of the transcription. "She did so," Bridge said, stopping abruptly and turning to point a thick finger at the dock. While he lay helpless, trusting in the bond of marriage, unaware that the woman who vowed to cherish him was instead preparing his grave. Mrs. Bartlett's head remained lowered. Her shoulders did not shake. If anything, she seemed to grow stiller, as though she were holding herself together by sheer force of will, a statue of grief carved from ice. Elias wrote faster. The cadence of Bridges' speech was relentless, a hammer striking the anvil of the jury's mind, shaping their thoughts before the defense could offer an alternative. He had to keep up. He could not miss a nuance, a hesitation, a change in tone that might reveal the cracks in the prosecution's armor. But the words were flowing too fast, a torrent of accusation that threatened to drown the truth before it could surface. "The stomach of the deceased," Bridge declared, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow carried even further than his shout, "was found to contain a quantity of chloroform sufficient to kill a grown man. There was no struggle, no mark of violence upon the skin, only the silent vapor doing its deadly work in the dark." Silent vapor. The phrase hung in the air, suspended like the smoke from the gas jets. It was a perfect description of the crime and a perfect description of the trial itself. Everything hinged on what could not be seen, what could not be touched, what existed only in the space between the words spoken in this room. Elias paused, the pen hovering over the paper. The ink gathered at the tip, a dark droplet ready to fall. He looked up again, unable to help himself. Mrs. Bartlett was looking at him. Not through him, not past him, at him. Her eyes were dark, deep pools that reflected nothing of the gaslight, nothing of the crowd, nothing of the fear that should have been there. They were empty of emotion, yet full of a terrible knowing. She knew he was writing it down. She knew he was recording the lies, the half-truths, the omissions that Elias Thorne would later prune from the official record, and she did not care. Or perhaps she knew something he did not, something about the nature of justice in this city, in this year, for a woman who stood accused of killing her husband with a handkerchief. The droplet of ink fell. It landed on the page, a small black stain spreading across the fibers, obscuring the word vapor. Elias froze. A mistake. In the official log, a mistake was a blemish on the integrity of the court. He should have caught it. He should have been faster, sharper, more detached. But the eyes held him, pinned him to the spot as effectively as if Elias had reached out and grabbed his wrist. "Miss Hale." Elias's voice cut through the haze, sharp and impatient. He was standing over the alcove, looking down with a frown etched into his forehead. "You have stopped. The council is proceeding." Elias blinked, breaking the connection. Mrs. Bartlett had turned her head away, back to the judge, back to the performance of innocence. The moment was gone, severed as cleanly as a thread snapped by a knife. "Apologies," Elias muttered, dipping the pen to cover the stain, to write over the error until it was hidden beneath layers of fresh ink. The light. "There is sufficient light," Elias said, his voice low, meant only for Elias' ears. "Do not let the theatrics distract you. Write what is said, nothing more." He moved away, merging back into the shadows of the bench, leaving Elias alone with the scratch of the pen and the smell of the ink. Elias wrote. He wrote the words Bridge spoke, the accusations of murder, the details of the autopsy, the scientific terms that sounded like spells cast to bind the prisoner to the crime. He wrote them all, filling the page with the official version of events, the version that would be printed in the papers, discussed in the clubs, remembered by history. But beneath the table, his other hand rested on the leather cover of the black book in his pocket. He could feel the warmth of it, the pulse of it, a second heart beating against his thigh. Bridge was speaking of the medical evidence now, calling the first witness, a doctor from Pimlico who had attended the deceased. The man took the stand, swearing the oath, his voice trembling slightly as he began to describe the contents of Thomas Bartlett's stomach. Elias listened, he wrote, and he waited for the moment when the words would fail, when the language of the law would prove insufficient to contain the truth of what had happened in that house on Lambeth Road. The doctor spoke of concentrations, of densities, of the impossibility of voluntary ingestion. Mrs. Bartlett stood still. The gallery held its breath. And Elias Thorne wrote on, knowing that the real story was not in the words he was committing to the page, but in the silence between them, the silence that Mrs. Bartlett carried with her like a secret weapon, sharp and invisible as the vapor itself. The doctor paused, consulting his notes. Elias lifted the pen. The next question would come, the trap would spring, and he would be there to record the sound of it closing. The witness swallowed, a dry click in the throat of a man accustomed to prescribing remedies for others. Dr. Stevenson adjusted his spectacles, the metal glinting under the gas jets, before he turned his face towards the prosecution bench. Mr. Poland stood rigid, his fingers drumming a silent rhythm against the wood of the rail, impatient for the contradiction that would seal the coffin lid. "Pray elaborate, Doctor," Poland said. His voice boomed, rebounding off the vaulted ceiling to drown out the shuffling of feet in the gallery. "You state the stomach contained a quantity sufficient to kill 3 men, yet you found no inflammation, no corrosion." "None whatsoever." Stevenson's hands remained clasped before him, clean and pale, devoid of the tremors that afflicted the usual crowd of onlookers. The mucous membrane was entirely intact, healthy, even. One might suppose the deceased had dined well an hour prior, save for the odor that clung to the internal organs. A murmur rippled through the room. It started at the back, near the ushers, and rolled forward like a tide, hitting a shingle beach, breaking against the bar where the counsel sat. Elias dipped his pen. The nib scratched, a harsh friction against the smooth fiber of the court paper, capturing the words but missing the weight of them. How does one transcribe an impossibility? He wrote intact. He wrote healthy. The ink flowed dark and wet, smelling of iron and gall, pooling in the loops of the letters before soaking in. Chloroform burned. Every chemist in London knew it burned. It blistered the lips. It seared the throat. It left a trail of destruction like acid poured upon stone. To suggest otherwise was to defy the very nature of the substance, to ask the jury to believe in a poison that acted like a ghost, entering the body without touching it. And the throat, Poland pressed. He leaned forward, his shadow stretching across the witness box, engulfing the doctor in a silhouette of accusation. Did you examine the larynx, the trachea? I did, Stevenson blinked, his eyes darting towards the judge, then back to the counsel. There was no redness, no excoriation, the passage was clear. Elias paused, his hand cramped, the muscles in his forearm tightening into a hard knot. He shook the pen, a sharp flick of the wrist to dislodge the gathering ink, but the drop fell anyway. It landed on the margin, a small black tear weeping down the side of the page. He did not blot it, let it stand, a mark of the error in the logic, a stain on the proceeding that no amount of scraping with a knife could remove. Across the court, Mrs. Bartlett sat motionless. She wore black silk that absorbed the light, refusing to reflect the gas lamps flickering above. Her hands lay folded in her lap, pale against the dark fabric, still as effigies carved from marble. She did not look at the doctor. She did not look at her husband's empty chair. She watched the dust motes dancing in the heat rising from the crowd, her expression unreadable, a mask of serene detachment that fooled no one who understood the cost of such control. Elias Thorne shifted in the clerk's alcove above. The leather of his chair creaked, a sharp protest against the quiet concentration of the room. He leaned down, his face emerging from the shadows like a moon breaking through cloud cover. Keep pace, Thorne, he whispered. The warning was soft, barely audible over the scratch of other pens, but it carried the weight of a threat. Do not lag. The judge dislikes gaps in the record. I am keeping pace, Elias replied. He did not look up. He focused on the nib, on the next word, on the lie being codified into law. The witness is speaking in paradoxes. Then write the paradox. As Elias straightened, his coat tails swished while he settled back into the gloom. It is not our duty to resolve them, only to record. Elias wrote. He recorded the healthy throat. He recorded the lethal dose. He built the contradiction line by line, creating a tower of words that stood on no foundation, reaching for a truth that refused to land. The air in the courtroom grew thick, heavy with the scent of unwashed wool and the coal smoke drifting in from the street below. It pressed against the lungs, making each breath a conscious effort, a labor akin to the work of the pen. Mr. Poland stepped back. He conferred briefly with his junior counsel, a whispered exchange of frustrated syllables that Elias caught only fragments of. Impossible, chemistry, jury. Call the next witness, Poland said. His voice lacked the boom from before. It was flatter now, drained of the certainty that had opened the session. The usher moved to the gate, his rod tapping against the floorboards. Dr. Redwood. Another man took the stand, clad in another coat of black cloth, another pair of hands that had cut into the dead and found nothing wrong with the flesh. The testimony repeated itself, a refrain of negation. No burns, no marks, no signs of struggle. The vapor had done its work and vanished, leaving the body pristine, a vessel untouched by the violence that had ended the life within. Elias' wrist ached. The pain radiated up his arm, settling in the shoulder as a dull, throbbing ache. He stopped writing for a moment, rolling the joint to loosen the stiffness, and looked at the clock high on the wall. The hands crept towards 1 o'clock. The gas jets hissed, a constant, sibilant background noise that drilled into the skull. Mr. Clark, the judge's voice cut through the drone. Lord Chief Justice Coleridge leaned forward, his wig pristine, his face a map of deep lines carved by decades of judgment. Do you wish to cross-examine now or after the adjournment? Sir Edward Clark rose. He moved with a fluid grace that belied his size, unfolding himself from the bench like a man stretching after a long sleep. He smoothed the front of his coat, his eyes fixed on the witness, but his posture relaxed, almost languid. "My lord, I think it best we resume after luncheon." Clark's voice was rich, resonant, filling the space without effort. "The medical gentlemen have tired themselves with such intricate details. We should all benefit from a moment of fresh air." A ripple of amusement moved through the gallery. It was a kindness, but it felt like a maneuver. Clark knew the contradiction hung in the air like smoke. He needed it to settle, to coat the jury's minds while they ate their chops and drank their ale, letting the impossibility of the prosecution's case digest alongside their food. "Court adjourned," Coleridge said. He tapped his gavel, the wood striking the block with a finality that echoed in the sudden rush of movement. Chairs scraped, boots clattered on the wood. The crowd surged towards the doors, eager to escape the stifling heat and debate the evidence in the safety of the street. Elias capped his inkwell. The metal lid clicked shut, sealing the dark fluid away from the air. He gathered his papers, stacking them into a neat pile, aligning the edges with precise, trembling fingers. Sealers descended from the alcove. He loomed over the desk, his shadow falling across Elias' work. "Take the book," Sealers said. He nodded towards the leather-bound ledger where the official transcript would be compiled. "And ensure the cipher is kept separate. I will not have your personal musings confused with the Crown's record." "They are not confused," Elias said. He slipped the black notebook into his inner pocket, feeling the weight of it against his ribs. "I know the difference." "See that you do." Sealers turned away, merging into the flow of clerks and ushers heading for the judge's chambers. "Be back by 2. Clark will not wait." Elias stood. His legs felt stiff, the blood sluggish in his veins after hours of sitting still. He navigated the crush of bodies, moving towards the exit where the light from the open doors beckoned, gray and diffuse. The air outside would be cold, thick with the fog that clung to the city, but it would be clean. It would smell of horse manure and wet stone, not of death and ink. He pushed through the doors and stepped onto the pavement. The noise of the street hit him immediately, a roar of wheels and shouts that drowned out the memory of the courtroom. A hansom cab rattled past, the driver whipping his horse to clear the path. Elias pulled his collar up against the damp chill. He had an hour, enough time to walk to Bloomsbury, enough time to face Mrs. Gable, and enough time to wonder if the truth he carried in his pocket was worth the coal she would deny him. He turned towards the north, walking into the grey. The notebook pressed against his ribs, a hard rectangle of leather binding digging into the wool of his waistcoat with every stride. Holborn stretched ahead, a canyon of grey brick and soot-stained stone where the fog clung low to the cobbles, trapping the smell of roasting chestnuts and horse dung in a stagnant pool beneath the eaves. Elias kept his head down, collar turned up, shielding his face from the damp air that seeped through his gloves and settled in the marrow of his bones. He did not look at the passers-by, the clerks and shopgirls rushing to snatch a meal before the clock struck 2, for fear of meeting a gaze that might recognize the ink stains on his fingers. 20 minutes to walk, 10 to eat, 10 to suffer. Boarding house on Great Russell Street stood somber and narrow, its front door painted a peeling black that matched the mood of the neighborhood. Elias pushed the latch, the mechanism stiff with cold, and stepped into the hallway where the air smelled of boiled cabbage and wet dog. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light falling from the fanlight above, swirling in a lazy vortex that mirrored the confusion in his head. He hung his coat on the stand, the damp fabric heavy as lead, and turned towards the stairs. "Mr. Thorne." The voice came from the parlor door, sharp as a cracked whip. Mrs. Gable stood in the frame, blocking the light from the gas lamp behind her. She wore a dress of stiff brown stuff that rustled when she shifted her weight, her hands clasped tight over her apron as if holding herself together. Her eyes, pale and unblinking, fixed on his face with an intensity that made his skin crawl. "Mrs. Gable," Elias nodded, keeping his hand on the newel post. "I have little time. The court resumes at 2. "Time is a luxury you seem to afford yourself in abundance, sir." She stepped into the hall, her boots clicking on the tiled floor. 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard you pacing. Writing, no doubt. Scribbling down the sins of that woman for the profit of men who will hang her or free her based on the scratch of your pen. It is my profession. It is a perversion. She moved closer, the smell of camphor and old lavender rising from her skirts. A man's place is not in the shadows of the Old Bailey, listening to filth, and certainly not a lodger in my house, where I expect decency, where I expect the grate to be warm upon my return, not cold as a grave. Elias looked past her, towards the door of his room. He knew what he would find before he opened it. The neglect was her weapon, a silent punishment for his hours, for his trade, for the gold sovereigns he paid, which kept the roof over her head, even as she despised the hand that offered them. The coal was damp, he said. It was a lie, and they both knew it. The coal was dry enough for anyone with a conscience. Mrs. Gable's chin lifted. Women like that Bartlett creature, they bring ruin upon themselves by stepping outside their sphere. And those who enable them, who give voice to their lies in court, they are no better. You think because you write it down it becomes truth. You think the law cares for the scratch of a nib. The law cares for what is spoken aloud. The words tasted like ash. Sealers had said them only hours before, and now they served as a shield against a landlady's wrath. Spoken aloud by men, she spat the word, not whispered by women in black silk who poison their husbands and smile whilst the coroner cuts. I have written to your employer, Mr. Thorne. I felt it my duty to inform them of the moral turpitude residing under their roof. A woman who spends her days amongst murderers must expect the soot of their sins to settle upon her skirt. Elias felt a spike of anger, hot and sudden, but he crushed it down. To argue was to give her power. To argue was to acknowledge that her opinion held weight in the world he inhabited, a world of facts and transcripts where sentiment had no currency. He stepped around her, his shoulder brushing the rough fabric of her sleeve. "See to the fire," he said. His voice was flat, devoid of the deference she demanded. "I shall require warmth this evening." "You shall require a character reference," she called after him as he climbed the stairs. "When they come for you, when they ask who knew of your habits, do not expect me to lie." The door to his room stood ajar. Inside, the air was stagnant, cold enough to see his breath in shallow plumes. The grate held only a few lumps of unburnt coal, grey and lifeless, surrounded by a ring of old ash that had not been swept away. He crossed to the window, looking out onto the street where the fog had thickened, blurring the gas lamps into hazy orbs of yellow light. A hansom cab rattled past, the wheels iron-shod and loud, drowning out the distant chime of a church clock. 1 o'clock. He sat at the desk, the wood cold beneath his palms, and opened the black notebook. The pages were filled with his cipher, a jagged script that no one else could read, recording the things the official transcript omitted. The tremor in Mrs. Bartlett's hand when she touched the rail. The way Sir Edward Clarke looked at the jury not with argument, but with pity. The scent of chloroform that seemed to hang in the courtroom, despite the open windows. A sweet, cloying ghost that no amount of ventilation could dispel. He picked up his pen. The nib hovered over the paper, ink gathering in a dark bead at the tip. "She does not look like a murderer," he wrote. "She looks like a woman waiting for a train." But was that truth, or was it the defense's narrative seeping into his mind? Clarke's strategy was not to prove innocence, but to make guilt seem impossible for a creature of such delicacy. A woman could not force a man to swallow poison. A woman could not wrestle a struggling husband without tearing her lace. The argument relied on the very stereotypes Mrs. Gable wielded like a poker, the idea that femininity was incompatible with violence, that biology dictated morality. Elias capped the pen. The click sounded loud in the quiet room. He stood and walked to the grate, kneeling to arrange the cold coal. His fingers came away black with soot, the stain grounding him in the physical world. He could not light the fire now, there was no time. The cold would have to remain, a physical reminder of the cost of his presence here. He brushed his hands on his trousers, leaving dark smudges on the grey wool, and picked up his hat. The walk back would be faster. The streets would be emptier. He thought of Clarke, waiting in the courtroom, polishing his spectacles, preparing to ask the question that would dismantle the prosecution's case. By what mechanism? The question hung in Elias' mind, echoing the silence of the cold grate. How does a vapor kill without a mark? How does a woman kill without strength? He locked the door behind him, the key turning with a heavy click. Mrs. Gable was gone from the hall, retreated to her parlor to write more letters, to plot more grievances. The house settled around him, groaning in the wind. Elias stepped out onto the pavement, pulling his gloves tight. The fog swallowed him whole, obscuring the path to the Old Bailey, but he knew the way by feel, by the slope of the ground and the smell of the river rising to meet him. He walked quickly, the notebook heavy in his pocket. The cold air bit at his cheeks, sharpening his senses, clearing the haze of Mrs. Gable's accusations from his mind. There was only the court now, only the record, only the words that would be spoken in the next hour, which he would catch and pin to the page like butterflies, beautiful and dead. The clock struck the half-hour as he turned onto Newgate Street. The courthouse loomed ahead, a dark mass against the grey sky, its windows glowing like eyes. He quickened his pace, the rhythm of his boots on the stone matching the ticking of the clock in his head. 2 o'clock approached. Clark would be waiting. The question would be asked, and Elias would have to write down the answer, even if it was a lie. The iron doors groaned on their hinges, admitting a draught of river damp that clashed with the stagnant warmth inside. Elias wiped his boots on the coir mat, removing the grey sludge of the street before stepping onto the flagged corridor. The smell hit him first, a thick broth of stale tobacco, wet wool, and the metallic tang of ink drying on hot gas jets. It was a scent that clung to the back of the throat, persistent as a cough. He moved through the crowd of loiterers, men in top hats and women in bonnets, who pressed against the walls to let the officials pass, their eyes tracking the movement with a hunger that had nothing to do with justice. Court number 1 breathed around him. The vaulted ceiling trapped the noise of shuffling feet and whispered commentary, amplifying it until it sounded like the sea inside a shell. Elias slipped into his alcove beneath the clerk's table, a shadowed recess where the light fell poorly and the air stood still. Elias Thorne sat above him, a mountain of black wool and stern judgment, arranging papers with a precision that bordered on violence. He did not look down. He did not need to. The scratch of Elias' nib would announce his presence soon enough. In the dock, Mrs. Bartlett sat motionless. Her black silk dress absorbed the gaslight rather than reflecting it, making her appear as a void in the center of the room. She watched Sir Edward Clark rise from the bench, her hands folded in her lap, fingers interlaced so tightly the knuckles showed white against the dark fabric. Clark adjusted his spectacles, the gold rims catching the flame, and turned to the witness box where the medical expert stood waiting. The doctor shifted his weight, boots scraping on wood, a small sound that echoed like a gunshot in the lull. Clark did not shout. He never did. His voice was an instrument of modulation, dropping low to force the jury to lean in, to conspire with him in the search for reason. He held a handkerchief in one hand, a square of white linen that looked starkly clean against his dark suit. He waved it gently, not as a prop, but as evidence of a negative truth. "Doctor," Clark said, the word elongated, rolling around the courtroom, "you have testified that chloroform is a corrosive agent, that it burns the skin it touches, that it leaves a mark upon the lips, the throat, the chin." "I have," the witness replied. His voice lacked the boom it had possessed during the prosecution's examination. It was thinner now, frayed at the edges. "Yet," Clark continued, pacing the floorboards, the leather of his shoes squeaking in rhythm with his words, "we are asked to believe that a woman of slight constitution and delicate frame administered this substance to a grown man, a man who was conscious, a man who was capable of resistance." He stopped, turning fully towards the jury box, ignoring the witness entirely for a heartbeat. "Tell me, doctor, in your experience, does a man swallow poison willingly when he knows it burns?" "No," the answer came too quickly. "Then he must have struggled." Clark moved back to the box, leaning in, resting one hand on the wooden rail. If he struggled, there would be spillage. There would be drops upon his waistcoat. There would be stains upon the hands of the person holding the cloth. He glanced towards the dock, a fleeting look that lasted no longer than a blink, yet carried the weight of an accusation and a defense simultaneously. Mrs. Bartlett's gown was examined. It was pristine, no marks, no burns. No evidence of a struggle. Elias' hand moved across the page, the nib scratching hard against the paper. He had to capture the cadence, the pause before the strike. The ink flowed dark and wet, recording not just the words but the space between them. He felt the ache in his wrist, a dull throb that traveled up to the elbow, but he did not stop. To stop was to lose the thread. To lose the thread was to fail Sealers. To fail Sealers was to lose the room, the heat, the only place where he mattered. Clark lifted the handkerchief again, holding it up to the light. "Imagine the scene," he said, his voice dropping to a conversational tone that excluded no one. "A bedroom, dim light, a husband resisting, a wife forcing the cloth to his face." He mimed the action, a gentle pressing motion that looked absurdly violent in the context of his calm demeanor. The chloroform spills. It runs down the chin. It drips onto the sleeve. It burns the skin of the administrator as surely as it burns the victim. He lowered the cloth. "Where are those burns, doctor? Where is the evidence of this physical contest?" The witness opened his mouth, closed it. He looked at the judge, Lord Chief Justice Coleridge, who sat immovable behind the high bench, face obscured by the haze of the room. There was no help there. The law cared for what was spoken, Sealers had said, but Clark was speaking in riddles that twisted the spoken word into something unrecognizable. He was building a wall of impossibility, brick by logical brick. Elias glanced up from his book. Mrs. Bartlett had not moved, yet the air around her seemed to shift. She was no longer just a woman accused. She was becoming a symbol of fragility, protected by the very stereotypes Mrs. Gable had wielded like a weapon in Bloomsbury. The landlady's voice echoed in his mind, sharp and bitter. A woman who spends her days amongst murderers. But here, in this room, a woman was safe because she was a woman. Because she could not possibly be strong enough to kill. The irony tasted like copper. "Surely," Clark pressed, his tone softening into something resembling pity, "you cannot suggest that a lady would wrestle her husband in the dark without tearing her lace, without leaving a trace upon herself." "It is possible," the witness muttered. The words were barely audible. "Possible?" Clark straightened, feigning surprise. "Or is it merely convenient for the Crown?" He turned back to the jury, spreading his hands. "We deal in facts, gentlemen, not in possibilities that defy the laws of physics and the nature of decency." He paused, letting the silence stretch, filling the room with the weight of the unanswerable. If the chloroform was forced, where is the mess? Where is the struggle? Where is the proof that a woman could overpower a man without leaving a single mark upon her own skin? Elias pressed the nib harder. The ink splattered, a tiny black star on the margin. He ignored it. The rhythm of the court was changing. The jury was leaning forward, their faces illuminated by the gas jets, eyes fixed on the defense counsel. They were not looking at the woman in the dock anymore. They were looking at the logic, the clean, unblemished logic that Clark was weaving around her like a shield. The science was too clumsy. The crime was too messy. The defendant was too clean. Clark stepped back from the box, smoothing his coat. He looked at the witness, then at the judge, and finally his gaze swept over the stenographer's alcove, passing over Elias without seeing him. He raised a finger, pointing not at anyone, but at the air itself, at the invisible vapor that hung over them all. "By what mechanism, pray?" Clark asked, the words distinct, carved out of the heavy air. "Did this vapor enter the deceased without a single drop touching the lips?" The question hung there, suspended in the smoke and the light. The witness stared at his hands, the jury stared at the floor, and Elias waited, pen poised, for an answer that the science of 1886 could not give. "Relevance," Clark said. The word snapped through the courtroom, sharp as a cracked whip, cutting off the prosecutor mid-sentence before he could finish his inquiry into the chemist's ledger. Mr. Poland, counsel for the Crown, stood frozen with his mouth slightly open, a half-formed question dying on his tongue regarding the purchase of 2 ounces of chloroform from a Pimlico apothecary 3 days prior to the death. He blinked, adjusting his spectacles, the glass lenses catching the yellow glare of the overhead jets until they flashed like warning signals. The gallery held its breath, a collective inhalation of stale tobacco and damp wool that pressed against Elias' ribs, heavy and suffocating. "My lord," Clark continued, turning his body towards the high bench where Lord Chief Justice Coleridge sat immovable, a statue carved from black oak and judicial patience. "We are invited to believe that the mere possession of a volatile spirit constitutes an admission of guilt. By this logic, every housewife in London who keeps laudanum for her children's teething or spirits of wine for cleaning her husband's razors stands ready for the gallows." He paused, letting the absurdity of the image settle into the woodwork, into the ink-stained fingers of the ushers, into the stiff collar of the stenographer below. The defense objects. The location of the bottle proves nothing of its administration. Elias' hand moved before his mind could catch up, the nib scratching a frantic rhythm against the paper, capturing the cadence of the objection rather than just the words. Objection sustained regarding relevance of possession alone. The shorthand symbols flowed from his wrist, a secret language of loops and dashes that only he and Sealers could decipher, though Sealers would later insist on smoothing the edges of the transcript to make the crown appear less flustered. The ink was cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from the gas burners above, which hissed softly, a serpentine sound that underscored the tension in the room. He did not look up at Clark, knowing that to break focus now would be to lose the thread of the argument, and losing the thread meant failing the record, and failing the record meant Sealers would have reason to cut him from the payroll. Poland shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the floorboards, a small, humiliating sound in the sudden quiet. He cleared his throat, a dry, rattling noise that drew the attention of the jury, 12 men in dark suits who looked increasingly bored by the technicalities of chemical volatility. "I merely seek to establish opportunity, my lord," Poland said, his voice lacking the boom it had possessed at the start of the morning, "that the accused had access to the means." "Access is not usage, Mr. Poland," Clark interrupted, stepping away from the bench to pace the floor, his movements fluid, predatory. He stopped beside the dock, close enough that the silk of his gown brushed against the iron bars separating him from Mrs. Bartlett. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, eyes cast down at the prayer book resting on her knees, though Elias knew she was not reading. Her stillness was unnatural, a performance of piety so perfect it felt like a rebuke to the chaos swirling around her. A kitchen knife provides access to a throat, yet we do not hang the cook for every dinner served. We require proof of the act, not the inventory of the cupboard. Elias pressed the nib harder, the metal tines spreading slightly to release a thicker flow of ink. He could smell the chemical tang of the fresh page, a sharp, acidic scent that mingled with the perfume Mrs. Bartlett wore, something floral and cloying that seemed to defy the grime of the Old Bailey. It was the smell of Lambeth Road, of a home that was supposed to be a sanctuary but had become a crime scene, a place where the air itself was suspected of carrying death. He remembered the testimony of the neighbors, the way they spoke of the house in hushed tones, as if the bricks themselves were listening. A quiet couple, they had said, never heard a raised voice. The silence of the house was now the silence of the court, a vacuum that Clark was filling with rhetoric while the truth evaporated like the chloroform in the stomach of the dead man. But the quantity, Poland insisted, desperation creeping into his tone, causing him to raise his voice, a mistake that made him sound petulant rather than authoritative. 2 ounces is sufficient to kill a grown man. Why would a lady require such an amount for cleaning? Clark turned slowly, a smile playing on his lips, not cruel but pitying, the smile of a tutor correcting a slow pupil. Perhaps she did not require it for cleaning. Perhaps she required it for the very purpose the chemist sold it, to relieve the neuralgia of a suffering husband. Or perhaps she bought it and never opened the bottle. We do not know. And that, gentlemen of the jury, is the entirety of the Crown's case, a series of perhapses built upon a foundation of might-haves. He gestured towards the witness box, where the chemist sat sweating through his waistcoat, his face flushed with the indignity of being cross-examined on the habits of his customers. The prosecution asks you to bridge the gap between purchase and murder with nothing but speculation. They ask you to assume the worst, because the science they present is too clumsy to explain the rest. The gas jets flickered, a draft from the open doors causing the flames to dance, casting long, wavering shadows across the faces of the jurors. One of them, a man with a thick beard and a heavy gold ring on his little finger, rubbed his chin, his eyes drifting from Poland to Clark, weighing the solidity of the arguments. Elias saw the shift, the subtle tilting of the scales that no official record would ever note. The transcript would show the words, the objections, the rulings, but it would not capture the way the jury's posture relaxed as Clark dismantled the idea of the poisonous housewife, replacing it with the image of a respectable Pimlico lady misunderstood by bumbling officials. It would not record the way Mrs. Bartlett's shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch, a release of tension so small it might have been a trick of the light, yet to Elias, watching from the shadows, it was a confession of relief. "Surely," Clark said, his voice dropping to a murmur that forced the entire room to lean in, straining to catch every syllable, We cannot convict a woman on the basis that she kept a bottle in her drawer. If we do, then we are not judging a crime, we are judging a household." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air, heavy and toxic. "And if that is the law, then God help us all." Poland sat down abruptly, the chair scraping loudly against the floor, a jarring note in the solemn proceedings. He began to shuffle his papers, stacking them into a neat pile, his movements stiff with defeat. The prosecutor knew he had lost the point, perhaps the momentum, perhaps the case itself. The chemistry of doubt had taken hold, spreading through the room like the very vapor they debated, invisible, odorless, and lethal to the truth. Elias stopped writing. His hand cramped, the muscles in his forearm tightening into a hard knot, but he did not rub it. He stared at the page, at the dense block of shorthand that represented the last 10 minutes of legal theater. He knew what Sellers would do with this. Sellers would trim the hesitation in Poland's voice, remove the descriptive flourishes about the jury's boredom, and present a clean, sterile account of a defense objection sustained. The official record would show a logical progression, a neat legal maneuver, not the dismantling of a man's career in real time. He looked up, his gaze drifting past the bench, past the ushers, to the corner where Elias Thorne stood. The chief clerk was watching him, not the lawyers. Sellers' eyes were narrow, his expression unreadable, but his hand rested on the edge of the clerk's table, fingers tapping a slow, rhythmic beat against the wood. Tap, 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 a signal, a warning, or merely the nervous tick of a man who knew exactly how the story was supposed to end. Elias dipped his pen into the inkwell, the metal rim cold against his fingertip. He had a choice. He could write what he saw, the sweat on the chemist's brow, the pity in Clark's smile, the quiet surrender of the crown. Or he could write what Sellers expected, the sanitized version that preserved the dignity of the court. The ink hung on the nib, a dark, trembling drop waiting to fall. From the holding cell behind the dock, a door creaked open, the sound of iron hinges grinding against rusted metal echoing in the sudden lull. A warder stepped out, nodding to Clark, who immediately turned his back on the defeated prosecutor to attend to his client. The performance was over, the preparation for the next act had begun. Elias watched them, the great advocate and the accused widow, and felt a cold prickle of unease crawl up his spine, a sensation that had nothing to do with the drafty courtroom and everything to do with the black notebook hidden beneath his coat. He capped his pen, the break was coming, and Sellers would be waiting for the notes. The gavel struck, a sharp crack that severed the air. 10 minutes, the usher barked, his voice flat and devoid of ceremony. Chairs scraped, boots shuffled, the low murmur of 200 people exhaling at once rose like steam from a boiling pot, thick with the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies. Elias did not move. He kept his head down, shielding the page with his left hand, while his right slid the sheaf of paper from the clip. The ink was still wet, glistening black in the gaslight, vulnerable to any passing sleeve. A shadow fell across his desk, not the diffuse gloom of the room, but a solid, cutting block of darkness that smelled of stale tobacco and dried lavender water. Elias Thorne leaned over the partition, his elbow resting on the wood with an ownership that made Elias' stomach turn. "Let us see the damage," Sellers said, his voice soft as a velvet glove wrapped around an iron rod. Poland sounded unsteady. Elias slid the paper across the desk. He watched Sellers' long, pale fingers trace the lines of shorthand, not reading the symbols, but sensing their density, the rhythm of the panic they encoded. The chief clerk's eyes narrowed. He tapped a fingernail against a specific cluster of dots and dashes near the bottom of the page. "This hesitation," Sellers murmured, barely moving his lips, noting the stutter when Clark mentioned the chemist's ledger. "It clutters the flow. The official record requires clarity, Elias, not the stammering of a defeated man." "It is what he said," Elias replied. The words felt heavy in his mouth. He paused. He searched for the page. And in doing so, he invited the jury to doubt his own competence. Sellers straightened, tucking the paper into the breast pocket of his coat with a smooth, practiced motion. "We shall streamline it, a continuous argument, logical, unbroken. The Crown does not stumble in the archives, Mr. Thorne, only in the room. You are altering the testimony. I am preserving the dignity of the court." Silas's gaze locked onto his, cold and unblinking. Do not mistake the scratch of your nib for the voice of conscience. The law cares only for what is spoken aloud and accepted as fact, not for the tremors in a prosecutor's throat. If you wish to keep your position and the roof over your head in Bloomsbury, you will transcribe the version I return to you, not the one you heard. He turned away before Elias could respond, merging into the crowd of barristers and clerks flowing towards the corridors. The threat hung in the air, heavier than the smoke. Elias sat frozen, his hand hovering over the empty page. The inkwell seemed to mock him, a dark pool of infinite capacity for lies. He needed air, or at least the illusion of it. Pushing back from the desk, he slipped into the throng, moving against the current of those seeking tea or tobacco. He navigated the narrow passage behind the dock, where the shadows were deepest and the ushers less vigilant. The door to the holding cell stood ajar, a sliver of dim light cutting the gloom. Voices drifted out, low and urgent. Elias stopped. He knew he should walk on, pretend to adjust his cufflinks or check the time on his pocket watch, but his feet rooted themselves to the flagstones. He pressed his back against the cold brickwork, leaning in just enough to catch the words without being seen. "Must not look at him," Clark was saying, his tone brisk and instructional as it stripped away the warmth he had projected in the courtroom. "When Poland rises again, you will look at your hands, fold them in your lap. Do not clench, for clenching suggests guilt. Instead, fold them like a child at prayer." A pause, the rustle of silk. "And the tears," Mrs. Bartlett's voice. It was thinner than Elias expected, stripped of the fragility she had worn for the jury, now sounding merely tired. "Am I to weep when he mentions the bottle?" "No," Clark's reply was sharp, a snap of the fingers cutting through the air. "Tears now would seem rehearsed, since you have already established your sorrow. Now you must show confusion, a gentle bewilderment that a respectable woman could be accused of such things. Let them see the innocence, Adelaide, not the grief. Grief implies loss, while innocence implies impossibility." Elias gripped the edge of his coat. The intimacy of the exchange sickened him. This was not justice, it was stagecraft. Clark was not defending a woman, he was directing a performance, tuning her expressions as one might tune a violin's string, seeking the precise pitch of acquittal. Mrs. Bartlett was not a client, she was a prop, to be positioned and lit, and moved according to the needs of the narrative. "Remember," Clark continued, his voice dropping lower, "you know nothing of chemistry, you do not know how it was administered, you do not know why it was in the house. You are a vessel, empty, pure." "I understand," she whispered. "Good, 10 seconds, then we return." Footsteps approached the door. Elias pushed off the wall, feigning a stumble as a junior clerk rounded the corner. He muttered an apology, brushing past the man and hurrying back towards the stenographer's alcove before anyone could question his presence near the cells. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. Back at his desk, the sheet of paper Silas had taken lay waiting. It had been returned while he was gone, placed neatly atop the blotter. Elias picked it up. The shorthand had been altered. Small carets inserted, symbols erased, the rhythm smoothed out. The stutter was gone. The doubt was excised. The crown now sounded confident, logical, and ultimately easily dismantled by Clark's superior rhetoric. It was a lie, a perfect, sterile lie. He reached for his pen, intending to copy the falsified version, to do his duty and survive the day. But his hand stopped. Beneath the official notes, in the margin where Silas's edits had crowded the text, Elias saw something else. A fragment of the chemist's original testimony that Silas had deemed irrelevant enough to cut entirely, yet specific enough to be dangerous. Purchase time, 8:45 p.m. Bottle unsealed upon return. Elias frowned. He glanced at the clock on the wall. The prosecution had established that Thomas Bartlett died shortly after returning from his club at 9:00 p.m. If the bottle was unsealed at 8:45 and Thomas arrived home at 9:00, the window for administration was impossibly tight without the husband noticing the smell. Unless the chloroform was not administered in the liquid form everyone assumed. Unless the method was something else entirely, something that left no trace of the bottle's opening. The discrepancy sat on the page, a tiny crack in the defense's flawless armor. Sealers had missed it, or perhaps deemed it too technical to matter, but it mattered. It was the thread that could unravel the whole tapestry. Elias looked at the black notebook hidden beneath his waistcoat. He could write it there. He could preserve the truth of the time log, the crack in the alibi, the detail that might condemn the woman's Sealers was so eager to protect through omission. But to write it was to acknowledge he knew it. To know it was to carry the weight of it. The usher banged the gavel again. Court resumes. The crowd surged back into their seats. Clark swept into the room, his face a mask of benevolent concern, ready to continue his theater of innocence. Mrs. Bartlett followed, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes cast down in perfect, rehearsed confusion. Elias dipped his pen. The ink touched the paper. He had to choose. The official record demanded one thing, the black notebook demanded another. And the truth, that silent vapor, waited to see which way the wind would blow. He began to write, but his hand trembled, the nib scratching a line that was neither fully truth nor fully lie, a jagged mark that would haunt him long after the gas jets were extinguished. Call Mr. George Pollock. The name dropped into the well of the court like a stone into a dry cistern, echoing off the dark oak paneling before dissipating into the hushed anticipation of the gallery. Elias adjusted his cuff, the starched linen biting into his wrist, and fixed his eyes on the witness box, where a small man in an ill-fitting frock coat was now climbing, his boots squeaking against the wooden steps with an intimacy that seemed obscene in such a solemn place. Pollock was a chemist from the Pimlico Road, a man whose hands were stained with the faint, permanent yellow of picric acid, a badge of his trade that no amount of scrubbing could remove. Mr. Pollock, said Mr. Poland, the prosecutor, his voice booming with a manufactured gravitas that failed to mask the tremor of fatigue beneath. You sold a quantity of chloroform to the prisoner on the evening of the 3rd of January. I did so. And at what time did this transaction occur? Pollock shifted his weight, wiping his palms on his trousers. Just before closing, 8:30, perhaps near 8:45. Elias' nib flew across the page, capturing the rhythm, the hesitation, the specific cadence of a man who knew he was being weighed against a life. But as he wrote, he felt the ghost of Elias Thorne's edits hovering over his shoulder, the invisible hand that had already smoothed the rough edges of the morning's testimony, turning stumbling uncertainty into polished fact. Sir Edward Clark rose. He did not shout. He never shouted. He unfolded himself from his seat with the languid grace of a cat stretching in sunlight, adjusting his spectacles with a deliberate slowness that forced the entire court to wait upon his pleasure. Mr. Pollock, Clark began, his voice a soft, velvety baritone that carried effortlessly to the back rows without effort. You keep a shop in a respectable neighborhood, a neighborhood of clerks, of civil servants, of women who manage households with economy and care. Is that not so? It is so. And in such a household, might one find chemicals for various purposes, for cleaning brass perhaps, or for soothing the pain of a toothache? Certainly, chloroform is a common article. Common, Clark repeated, letting the word hang in the air, tasting it, turning it over for the jury to inspect. So if a lady were to purchase a small bottle, it would not be remarkable. It would not be the act of a murderess, but merely the act of a housewife attending to her duties. No, sir, not remarkable at all. Elias stopped writing. The logic was flawless, seductive, and entirely detached from the smell of death that still seemed to cling to the clothes of the woman sitting in the dock. Clark was not arguing facts. He was constructing a reality where the purchase of poison was as mundane as the purchase of flour, a rhetorical sleight of hand that made the horrific seem banal. The jury leaned forward, their faces slack, drinking in the reassurance that their world was not so fragile that a bottle of spirits could shatter it. But Elias knew the time. He knew the minutes between 8:45 and 9:00 were a chasm too wide to bridge with polite conversation about toothaches. He looked down at his sheet, at the carrots and erasures Sealers had imposed, and felt a cold sweat prickle at the hairline. The official record would show a casual purchase. The truth was a race against a dying man's breath. Thank you, Mr. Pollock, Clark sat. The afternoon wore on, the gas jets hissing softly as the light outside faded into a murky grey twilight that pressed against the high windows, desperate to enter, but barred by the grime of centuries. Another witness was called, a neighbour from Lambeth Road, a stout woman with a face reddened by the heat of her own kitchen and a voice that carried the sharp edge of suspicion. Mrs. Gable, Poland asked, inquiring whether she had heard anything unusual on the night in question. Any cries, any disturbance? The woman shook her head, her cap ribbons trembling as she replied, "Nothing, sir, not a sound." The house, she insisted, was as quiet as a churchyard. Quiet, Clark murmured, just loud enough for Elias to catch. Silence is the friend of the innocent, is it not, or is it the shroud of the guilty? He did not wait for an answer. He turned to the jury, his eyes wide, feigning a profound sadness. A quiet house, a respectable street, and yet we are asked to believe that within those walls a horror was enacted without a whisper, without a struggle, without a single note of alarm to pierce the air. It is impossible, gentlemen. It is a fantasy born of malice. Elias' hand cramped. The words poured out, a flood of exonerating rhetoric that washed over the facts, drowning them in a sea of plausible denial. He watched Mrs. Bartlett in the dock. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes lowered in the exact posture Clark had prescribed. She looked like a saint in a stained glass window, untouched by the filth of the accusation. But Elias remembered the voice he had heard in the corridor, the tired, flat tone that had asked about tears. It was not the voice of a saint. It was the voice of an actress waiting for her cue. The court adjourned at 4. The gavel fell with a dull thud, signaling the end of the day's performance, and the crowd began to stir, shuffling their feet, gathering their coats, eager to escape the stifling atmosphere of the courtroom and breathe the cold, coal-smoke air of the street. Elias remained seated. He waited until the room had emptied, until the ushers were sweeping up the scattered papers and the judges had retreated to their private chambers. Then, and only then, did he reach into his waistcoat and withdraw the black notebook. It was small, bound in cheap leather that was already peeling at the corners, a stark contrast to the official foolscap that lay stacked neatly on his desk. He opened it to a fresh page, the paper rough and unbleached, waiting to receive a truth that would never see the light of day. 8:45 p.m. purchase, 9:00 p.m. death. He wrote the words quickly, his handwriting jagged, hurried, as if he feared the ink might evaporate before it dried. The discrepancy screamed at him from the page. 15 minutes. Enough time to buy the poison, to return home, to unseal the bottle, but not enough time to administer it in the manner the prosecution suggested, not without the husband smelling the sweet, cloying scent that clung to everything it touched, unless the method was different, unless the chloroform had not been poured but breathed. A shadow fell across his desk. Elias snapped the book shut, his heart leaping into his throat, and shoved it back inside his coat before he looked up. Elias Thorne stood there, his face impassive, his eyes sharp and unreadable in the dimming light. "Working late, Mr. Thorne?" Elias asked, his voice devoid of inflection. "Checking the times, sir," Elias replied, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "The chemist's testimony, I wanted to ensure the transcript was accurate." "Accuracy is a relative term in this business," Elias said, stepping closer. He picked up the official sheet, running a finger over the edited lines. "The law does not require every stutter, every hesitation. It requires clarity. It requires a narrative that makes sense to 12 men who know nothing of chemistry and less of marriage. And if the narrative is false?" Elias looked at him then, a long, hard stare that seemed to strip away Elias' pretense of neutrality before he spoke. "Then it is a falsehood that serves the greater good. The reputation of this court, Mr. Thorne, is a fragile thing, unable to withstand the chaos of ambiguity. We provide order. We provide resolution." He placed the sheet back on the desk, smoothing it down with a paternal pat. "Do not mistake the scratch of your nib for the voice of conscience. Go home. The fog is rising, and it is no place for a man with too many thoughts in his head." Elias turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall, leaving Elias alone with the silence and the black book burning against his ribs. He looked at the door, then at the window where the gas lamps were flickering to life outside, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. He had the truth. He had the crack in the armor, and he had no idea what to do with it. He stood up, pulling his coat tight around him, and walked out into the corridor, the weight of the unsaid pressing down on him, heavier than any verdict. Red brick, white stone dressing, a single bed pushed hard against the north wall. The witness droned on, a constable from Lambeth whose voice possessed the flat, dusty quality of a man reading a grocery list rather than describing the chamber where a husband had ceased to breathe. Elias' nib scratched across the official foolscap, capturing every noun, every preposition, binding the domestic architecture into the permanent record of the Crown. But the ink felt thick, sluggish, resisting the flow of words that sought to sanitize a death scene. North Wall. Elias paused. His hand hovered, the nib trembling slightly above the paper, leaving a tiny, dark blot that threatened to bleed through to the next page. He did not wipe it away. Instead, his mind, traitorous and vivid, constructed the room. He saw the pattern of the wallpaper, likely floral, now peeling in the damp corners where the Thames mist seeped through the mortar. He smelled the chemicals. Not the sharp, clinical sting of the hospital ward, but something sweeter, heavier, clinging to the curtains and the counterpane like a grease that no amount of scrubbing could remove. The constable spoke of a washstand, of a basin, of the precise distance between the bed and the door, yet he made no mention of the air. How does one transcribe the atmosphere of a tomb? Did you observe any vessel, any rag, any material saturated with the spirit? Sir Edward Clarke's voice cut through the muggy heat of court number 1, sharp as a lancet. He stood near the bar, one hand resting lightly on the rail, his posture deceptively relaxed, as if he were merely discussing the weather rather than dismantling the prosecution's entire theory of administration. The gas jets above hissed, a steady, insect-like whine that seemed to underscore the tension radiating from the well of the court. "I did not, sir," the constable admitted, shifting his weight from one boot to the other. "Nor did my colleagues. We searched the premises thoroughly, every drawer, every box, under the mattress." "Nothing," Clarke repeated, letting the word hang in the smoke-filled air, allowing it to expand, to fill the silence until it became a physical presence. "You found a bottle, yes, uncorked, partially empty." "Yes, sir, on the mantelpiece." "And yet no rag, no handkerchief stained with the substance, no bowl in which it might have been warmed." Clarke took a step forward, his eyes locking onto the witness, stripping away the uniform to reveal the uncertainty beneath. "Tell me, constable, if a woman were to pour chloroform onto a cloth and hold it to a sleeping man's face until his heart stopped, would she not leave a trace? Would the fabric not reek of the sweet, sickly odor for days? Would she not be forced to burn it, or hide it, or wash it with a fervor that would strike any observer as suspicious? She might have disposed of it, sir." "Might she?" Clarke turned to the jury, his expression one of mild, baffled amusement. "And where, gentlemen, did she dispose of it? Into the fire? Then why did the grate contain only cold ash and ordinary soot? Into the river? Then why was no wetted cloth found in the dustbin or the privy? The prosecution asks you to believe in a murder committed with a volatile spirit that leaves no mark upon the throat, no stain upon the linens, and no vessel of administration save a bottle that sits openly on the mantel. They ask you to believe in a ghost." Elias wrote it down. "They ask you to believe in a ghost." The words looked stark on the page, devoid of the sarcasm that had colored Clarke's tone, stripped of the subtle inflection that suggested the defense counsel knew exactly how the deed was done even as he proclaimed its impossibility. It was a performance of ignorance, a theatrical display of doubt designed to exploit the gaps in scientific understanding, and it was working. Elias could see it in the shifting posture of the foreman, in the way the men in the gallery leaned forward, their faces illuminated by the flickering gaslight, hungry for a narrative that resolved the uncomfortable ambiguity of a death without violence. The clock on the wall struck 4. The sound was dull, muffled by the heavy drapery and the weight of the crowd, but it signaled the end of the day's proceedings. Lord Chief Justice Coleridge rose, his robes rustling like dry leaves, and the court erupted into the chaotic shuffling of coats and benches. Elias capped his inkwell. His fingers were stained black, the pigment ground deep into the whorls of his finger marks, a permanent mark of his trade. He packed his papers into the leather satchel, moving slowly, deliberately, avoiding the rush of the ushers who were already sweeping up the discarded briefs and scattered notes. He waited until the room had thinned, until the roar of voices had diminished to a murmur, before he stood and made his way to the exit. The street outside offered no relief. The fog had descended, thick and yellow, rolling off the river to wrap the Old Bailey in a suffocating blanket that dampened sound and blurred the lines of the buildings. Gas lamps glowed like suspended eyes in the gloom, casting weak, futile circles of light onto the wet pavement. Elias pulled his collar up against the damp, the cold seeping through his waistcoat, and began the walk back to Bloomsbury. He did not take the direct route. He wound through the narrower alleys, avoiding the main thoroughfares where the omnibuses clattered and the newsboys shouted the evening headlines. He needed the quiet. He needed the space to think, to separate the official record from the truth that churned in his gut. But when he reached the boarding house, the silence he craved was already broken. The front door stood ajar. A sliver of light spilled from the parlor onto the dark tiles of the hallway. Elias froze, his hand tightening on the strap of his satchel. He pushed the door open, the hinges creaking softly, and stepped inside. Mrs. Gable stood in the center of the small sitting room, her back to him. She was holding his satchel, not the official one, but the smaller, private case where he kept his personal effects and the black notebook. Her shoulders were hunched, her head bowed as she rummaged through the contents, her movements frantic, desperate. "Mrs. Gable." She spun around, her face flushed, her eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and defiance. She clutched a bundle of papers to her chest, her knuckles white. "Mr. Thorne, you are early." "I am precisely on time," Elias said, his voice low, dangerous. He closed the door behind him, the latch clicking with finality. "What are you doing with my things?" "Protecting this house," she snapped, her voice trembling despite her attempt at sternness. "Protecting my reputation. Do you think I do not hear the whispers? A woman living alone with a man who spends his days amongst murderers, his nights scribbling in codes. People talk, Mr. Thorne. They say you are involved, that you are aiding the defense with illicit information." "That is absurd." "Is it?" She thrust the papers towards him, her hand shaking, before demanding, "What is this, then?" It was cipher, she insisted, a collection of symbols that looked nothing like the Queen's English. "I have written to your employer, Mr. Thorne," she declared, explaining that she had felt it her duty. After all, a woman of her standing simply could not harbor suspicion. Elias crossed the room in 2 strides and snatched the papers from her grip. They were indeed his private notes, the shorthand mixture of symbols and abbreviations he used to capture the nuances the official transcript ignored. To an untrained eye, they looked like sorcery. To Mrs. Gable, they were proof of sin. "These are legal notes, Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "Shorthand, a method of speed, not secrecy. If you had bothered to ask, rather than rifle through my belongings, I would have explained." She straightened her apron, her chin lifting, though her eyes refused to meet his. "The law is a man's world, Mr. Thorne. It soils those who enter it. I only wish to ensure that the soot does not spread to my other lodgers." "Then trust me to keep my soot to myself," Elias replied, turning away from her, walking towards the stairs. "And do not write to my employer again. The next letter you send will be the last thing you write from this address." He climbed the stairs, taking them 2 at a time, fleeing the accusation in her eyes, the smell of her lavender water mixed with the stale odor of coal dust. Inside his room, he locked the door and leaned against it, breathing hard. The gaslight was low, casting long, dancing shadows across the peeling wallpaper. He moved to the desk, placing the black notebook on the surface. He opened it to a fresh page. "Method unknown, no rag found, Clark knows." He picked up his pen. The ink flowed smoothly this time, dark and fluid. He began to write not in shorthand, but in full sentences, describing the scene as he had imagined it in the court. The bedroom, the bed against the north wall, the bottle on the mantel. He wrote of the vapor, invisible and weightless, drifting through the air to settle in the lungs of a sleeping man. He wrote of a handkerchief that was never found because it had never been used. He wrote of a woman who might have poured the liquid directly, or perhaps used a tube, or perhaps something else entirely, a method so simple it escaped the detection of the most thorough search. The words piled up, a confession of speculation, a record of the truth that could not be spoken aloud. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the page was filled with the dense, dark script of his own uncertainty. Then he stopped. He looked at the words, at the dangerous thoughts that now existed outside his head. Slowly, deliberately, he took the pen and scratched a heavy line through the paragraph, then another. He crossed out the speculation, the theory, the imagined method, until the page was a mess of black ink, obscuring the truth beneath a layer of deliberate obfuscation. He watched the ink dry, the lines blurring together, becoming indistinct, just like the vapor itself. Outside, the fog pressed against the window, a silent, grey witness to the crime he had just committed on paper. He closed the book and blew out the candle, plunging the room into darkness, but the image of the scratched-out page remained burned into his mind, a ghost that would not leave him alone. The nib scraped, a dry, insectal sound against the grain of the paper. Elias stared at the blacked-out paragraph. The ink had not yet fully surrendered to the page. It sat wet and glossy in the troughs of his violent crossings, a small swamp of obliterated thought. He could still read the words beneath if he tilted the sheet towards the dying flame of the gas jet. Tube, paw, hand. 3 possibilities, 3 methods of killing a husband without leaving a bruise, now buried under a landslide of his own fear. His hand trembled, not from cold. The room was stifling, the air thick with the smell of burnt paraffin and the damp plaster that sweated through the wallpaper whenever the fog rolled in from the river. He wiped his palm on his trouser leg, leaving a smear of grease on the wool. Downstairs, the front door clicked shut. Mrs. Gable had retired to her parlor, no doubt to seal the letter she had threatened him with. The scratch of her pen would be softer than his, more deliberate, each loop of her cursive a stitch in the shroud she intended to wrap around his career. She believed she was protecting the moral order of the house, scrubbing away the stain of the Old Bailey before it seeped into the floorboards. She did not understand that the stain was not on the outside. It was in the ink. It was in the act of writing down what the law refused to acknowledge. He reached for the blotter. Zdob. The word did not come from his throat. It arrived in his chest, a heavy stone dropping into a well. If he blotted the page now, the wet ink would smear, creating a Rorschach of guilt that even a layman might decipher as an attempt to hide something. If he left it, the crossed-out text remained legible, a paradox of preservation. To erase the truth, he had to leave it visible but forbidden. He pushed the blotter away. The leather surface felt cool, slick with the humidity of the room. Clark had known. In the courtroom, amidst the roar of the gallery and the shuffling of jurors, Sir Edward George Clark had known exactly where the weakness lay. He had not asked the inspector if the handkerchief was found. He had asked why it was not there. The distinction was a razor's edge. The prosecution stood on the solid ground of chemistry, pointing to the chloroform in the stomach, the fatal dose that had stopped Thomas Bartlett's heart while he slept. They had the science. They had the motive, painted in broad strokes of an unhappy marriage and a young wife with a lover, but they lacked the vessel. Elias picked up the pen again. He hovered it over the margin. Absence is not proof. He wrote the words quickly, the shorthand symbols tangling together like barbed wire. Then he stopped. This was dangerous. Elias Thorne would call it treason. The chief clerk viewed the court record as a cathedral, a structure of glass and stone that must remain unblemished by the doubts of the workmen who built it. Thorne redacted the hesitations, the stammers, the moments where the judge's brow furrowed in confusion. He polished the transcript until it shone with the illusion of certainty. To introduce the concept of absence as a defense strategy in a private journal was to invite the same redaction knife into this room. A carriage rattled past on the pavement outside, the iron rims striking the cobblestones with a rhythmic clatter that vibrated through the floorboards and up into the legs of the desk. The sound faded, swallowed by the fog, leaving the silence heavier than before. Elias leaned back. The chair creaked, a lonely complaint in the stillness. He looked at the black notebook, then at the official transcript stack bound in red tape on the corner of the desk. 2 versions of the same day, one for the public, clean and linear, where questions led to answers and verdicts followed logic. The other, this black book, was a swamp of maybes and might-have-beens, a place where a woman could pour poison into a sleeping man's mouth without a rag, without a bottle, without a witness, and walk free because the law could not conceive of a crime without a tool. He thought of Mrs. Bartlett. In the dock, she had sat like a statue carved from ice, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the wood grain of the railing. She had not wept when the description of the bedroom was read out. She had not flinched when the police inspector admitted, under Clark's withering gaze, that no trace of chloroform had been found on the linens, the floor, or the furniture. The liquid had vanished. It had done its work and evaporated, leaving nothing but a sweet, sickly memory in the nostrils of those who entered the room too late. Just like the words on this page. Elias reached for the candle snuffer. His fingers closed around the cold metal bell. He hesitated. To extinguish the light was to end the day, to accept that the writing was done. But the writing was never done. The trial would resume tomorrow. Clark would dismantle another pillar of the prosecution's case. The jury would drift further towards acquittal, not because they believed in her innocence, but because the method of the murder remained a ghost, invisible and uncatchable. He lowered the snuffer over the flame. The wick hissed, a tiny, dying breath, and a plume of white smoke curled upward, twisting in the stagnant air before dissipating into nothingness. Darkness rushed in to fill the void. Elias sat in the blackness, his eyes wide, adjusting to the lack of light. The smell of extinguished wax hung heavy, cloying, reminiscent of the chemical sweetness described by the toxicologist. For a moment, just a heartbeat, he could not tell if the scent was from the candle or from his own memory of the court, the two realities bleeding together in the gloom. He waited. Below, the floorboard groaned. Mrs. Gable was moving again, or perhaps it was the house settling, the timbers contracting in the night chill. It did not matter. The letter was written. The post would be collected at dawn. By the time he returned from the Old Bailey, Elias Thorne might already have a summons on his desk, or worse, a note of dismissal wrapped in the stern morality of a man who valued order over truth. Elias placed his hand flat on the black notebook. The paper was still damp where he had crossed out the theory. He could feel the texture of the wet ink through the cover, a raised scar on the surface of the book. Tomorrow he would have to transcribe Clark's closing arguments. He would have to capture the flow of rhetoric that would surely sweep the jury away, turning the lack of evidence into a monument to reasonable doubt. He would write it all down, every word, every pause, every triumphant flourish. And then he would come back here, to this room, and he would have to decide whether to burn the black book or to hide it deeper, beneath the loose floorboard near the hearth where the drafts were strongest. The decision hung in the dark, unresolved. He stood up. The movement stirred the air, causing the faint smell of smoke to shift and curl around his face. He walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. Outside, the gas lamps of Bloomsbury were mere halos in the fog, distant and unreachable. Somewhere beyond that grey wall, Lambeth Road lay quiet. The red brick house with the white stone dressing stood silent. The bedroom was empty now, stripped of the body, scrubbed of the scent, yet the ghost of the vapor remained, lingering in the imagination of every man who had heard the testimony. Elias turned from the window. He could not sleep, not with the black book sitting on the desk, a silent accuser in the dark. He moved back towards the table, his hand reaching out in the darkness to find the edge of the wood, to ground himself in the physical world before the night could pull him under completely. His fingers brushed the cover of the notebook. He would not burn it, not yet. The truth, however dangerous, was the only thing he possessed that was entirely his own. A key scraped against the lock. The metal shrieked, a jagged tear in the quiet that sent Elias stumbling back from the desk, his hip colliding with the hard edge of the washstand. Pain flared, sharp and immediate, grounding him in the room before the door swung inward. Mrs. Gable stood in the frame, a candle held high in one trembling hand, the flame guttering in the draught she had created. Her dressing gown, a shabby thing of faded floral print, hung loose around her shoulders, revealing the stark white of her nightcap and the severe line of her jaw. She did not look at Elias. Her eyes, small and bright as beetle shells, swept the room, landing first on the open window, then on the scattered papers, and finally settling on the black notebook, where his hand still rested. "Searching for drafts, are we?" Her voice was dry, stripped of sleep, carrying the accusatory weight of a woman who believed the night belonged to God and respectable people, not to men who wrote in cipher by candlelight. "Or perhaps searching for something that does not belong to you." Elias pulled his hand away from the book, letting it fall to his side. The movement was too quick, a flinch he could not suppress. "The air was stale, Mrs. Gable. I required a breath of it." "Stale air is preferable to the stench of scandal." She stepped into the room, her bare feet making no sound on the worn rug, closing the distance between them with a predatory grace that belied her age. The candlelight cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper, making the room seem smaller, the walls pressing in. "I heard you moving about, pacing, writing." A man who spends his days amongst murderers and thieves must expect the soot of their sins to settle upon his skirt, no matter how vigorously he scrubs. She reached out not to touch him, but to tap the cover of the black notebook with a long, bony finger. The nail clicked against the leather, a sharp, brittle sound. "And what is this? More of your court work, or is it something else, something private?" "It is procedure," Elias said, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth as he kept his voice level, forcing the tremor from his throat. "Notes on the testimony, clarifications for the transcript, nothing of interest to anyone but the chief clerk." "Clarifications," she sniffed, the sound loud in the small space, before stating that while Mr. Thorne had told her she was diligent, he did not mention she was secretive. "There is a difference, you know. Diligence serves the law, whereas secrecy serves the self." As she leaned closer, the smell of lavender water and old wool drifted from her clothes to mask the underlying scent of damp plaster that permeated the house. "I have written to your employers, you know, to the agency. They should know the kind of company you keep and the places you haunt. For a woman in your position, alone, unchaperoned amongst such filth, reflects poorly on the house. On me." Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The threat was not new, but hearing it spoken aloud in the dead of night made it tangible, a physical weight pressing against his chest. He thought of Elias Thorne, of the redacted records, of the delicate balance he maintained between truth and survival. If Mrs. Gable's letters reached his superiors, if they questioned his morality, his access to the court would vanish. He would be nothing, a ghost in his own life. "My position is that of a professional," he said, stepping forward, forcing her to retreat slightly. The candle flame wavered, casting her face into momentary darkness before illuminating it again, harsh and unforgiving. "My work is essential. Without it, the record is incomplete. Is that not what you desire? Order, truth." "Order is knowing one's place," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "And your place is not here, scribbling in the dark while honest people sleep. You think because you wear a suit and carry a briefcase that you are above the rules that govern the rest of us, that you are immune to the consequences of your actions." She gestured vaguely at the window, at the fog beyond. "The world outside is watching. They see a woman playing at being a man. They see a lodger who hides his papers. They wonder what else is hidden." Elias looked at the notebook. The wet ink of his scratched-out theory seemed to glow in the candlelight, a dark secret waiting to be exposed. He thought of the chloroform, invisible and scentless, how it had killed a man without leaving a mark, how it had turned a home into the scene of the murder without a single drop of blood. And now here, in this room, the same invisibility was being used against him. Mrs. Gable could not see the truth in the book, but she could smell the deception. "There is nothing hidden," Elias said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Only the work, the same work I do every day, the same words I write every night. If you do not believe me, you are welcome to look." He pushed the book towards her, a gamble, a desperate attempt to call her bluff. If she opened it, she would see the cipher, the strange symbols that meant nothing to anyone but him. She would see the madness of his obsession, but she would not understand the content, not unless he told her. Mrs. Gable stared at the book, then at Elias. Her hand hovered over the cover, trembling slightly. For a moment he thought she would take it, would rip it from the desk and devour its secrets. Then, slowly, she withdrew her hand, curling her fingers into a fist at her side. "I do not need to look," she said, her voice low, filled with a venom that chilled the air between them. "I know what is in there. It is the same thing that is in all such books. Lies, justifications, the desperate scribblings of a soul that has lost its way." She turned abruptly, the skirts of her dressing gown swirling around her ankles. "Lock your window, Mr. Thorne. The fog is thick tonight. It gets into everything, even the mind." She left the room, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click that sounded louder than the initial scrape of the key. The lock engaged, a finality that echoed in the silence. Elias stood alone in the dark, the candle on the desk burning low, the wax pooling around the base. He looked at the notebook, at the scar of ink where he had tried to capture the impossible. Mrs. Gable was right about one thing. The fog did get into everything. It seeped through the cracks, the keyholes, the walls, filling the spaces between words, between thoughts, between what was known and what was suspected. He sat down, the chair creaking under his weight. He picked up the pen, the nib cold against his fingers. The inkwell was nearly empty, a dark pool reflecting the flickering flame. He dipped the pen, the metal scraping against the glass, and hovered it over the page. The theory was there, in his mind, clear and terrible. The handkerchief, the sleeping husband, the precise angle of administration. It fit. It made sense in a way the legal arguments did not. But to write it was to make it real, to give it a form that could be found, read, understood. Elias moved the pen. The nib touched the paper, leaving a tiny, dark dot. He began to write, the cipher flowing from his hand, a secret language for a secret truth. He wrote of the vapor, of the silence, of the woman who walked free. He wrote until his hand cramped, until the candle sputtered and died, plunging the room into darkness once more. He did not light it again. He sat in the blackness, the book closed before him, the words trapped inside, safe for another night. But the smell of the extinguished candle remained, cloying and sweet, a reminder that some things, once released, can never be fully contained. Tomorrow the court would convene, Clark would speak, the jury would decide, and Elias would write it all down, every word, every lie, every truth that could not be spoken. He would fill the pages until they burst, until the ink ran dry, until the silence was so loud it drowned out everything else. He waited for the dawn. The scratch of Mr. Poland's pen against the desk sounded like a rat gnawing at a bone, sharp, frantic, and utterly devoid of hope. Elias Thorne did not look up. His own nib danced across the page, capturing the stuttering rhythm of the prosecution's collapse, the way the words tumbled out faster than the logic could support them, a cascade of legal terminology that meant nothing without the science to hold it upright. The air in court number 1 hung heavy, thick with the smell of damp wool from the gallery and the sour tang of nervous sweat rising from the dock where Mrs. Bartlett sat, her hands folded in her lap, a statue of white marble amidst the grime of the Old Bailey. She did not tremble. She did not glance at the jury. She stared at the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood perhaps, or simply waiting for the world to finish its turning. "It is a matter of chemistry, my lord," Poland said, his voice cracking on the final syllable, a dry twig snapping underfoot. "But the method, the precise mechanism of administration remains." He trailed off. The sentence hung there, unfinished, a bridge leading nowhere. Elias wrote it down. Remains, a word that suggested persistence, but in this context, it meant absence. It meant the Crown had no story to tell, only a body in a coffin and a bottle of liquid that could have been poured anywhere, at any time, by any hand or by no hand at all. The gallery murmured, a low rumble that started in the back rows and rolled forward like thunder across a valley, vibrating through the floorboards and up into the soles of Elias' boots. They smelled blood. Not the red, iron-rich kind that stained the streets after a knife fight in Whitecapel, but the cold, invisible scent of a case disintegrating before their eyes. Sir Edward Clark rose. The movement was fluid, unhurried, a predator stretching limbs that had known only rest while the prey exhausted itself. He adjusted his cuffs, the white linen stark against the black of his coat, and turned to face the 12 men who held the power of life and death in their calloused hands. These were merchants, clerks, a baker with flour still dusting his waistcoat, men who believed a woman's place was by the fire, not by the chemistry set. "My lord," Clark began, his voice a rich baritone that filled the cavernous room without effort, wrapping around the pillars and settling into the corners where the gas jets hissed their blue-flamed warnings. "We are asked to believe that this delicate creature, this wife who tended to her husband with a devotion that shames us all, possessed the strength of a dockworker and the heart of a butcher. He paused, let the image settle. The baker shifted in his seat, frowning. To administer chloroform in the manner suggested by the prosecution requires a grip of iron, Clark continued, pacing the floor, his boots clicking a rhythmic counterpoint to his words. It requires a coldness of spirit that freezes the blood in the veins. It requires a woman to become something other than a woman. And I put it to you, gentlemen, that nature does not allow for such a transformation without leaving a mark far deeper than any poison could carve. Elias' hand cramped. The shorthand symbols blurred before his eyes, a swarm of insects dancing on the paper. He forced his fingers to obey, digging the nib into the pulp, capturing the cadence of the appeal, the way Clark twisted the knife of societal expectation until it drew blood from the very concept of justice. It was brilliant. It was vile. It had nothing to do with chloroform and everything to do with the fear that lived in the hearts of men who could not imagine a world where a wife might look at her husband and see not a provider, but an obstacle. Mrs. Bartlett looked down. Elias wrote it. He did not write that her eyelashes fluttered or that a tear might have been forming because he could not see them from his alcove. He wrote only what was there, the downward tilt of the head, the submission, the performance of fragility that fit so perfectly into the mold Clark had crafted for her. The murmurs in the gallery grew louder, turning into nods, into shifts of posture that signaled agreement. The baker straightened his spine. The clerk next to him rubbed his chin, his eyes fixed on the widow with a newfound pity that looked suspiciously like absolution. Elias stopped writing. His hand hovered over the page, the inkwell reflecting the flickering light above. He could feel the weight of the black notebook in his coat pocket, pressing against his ribs, a hard, secret lump that contained the things Clark was carefully editing out of the record. The doubts, the inconsistencies, the way Mrs. Bartlett's voice had sounded when she spoke of the night her husband died, not with grief, but with a flat, hollow tone that suggested a room emptied of furniture. A shadow fell across his desk. Elias froze. He did not need to look up to know who stood there. The smell of stale tobacco and old parchment announced Elias Thorne before the man even spoke, a scent that clung to the chief clerk like a second skin, marking him as a creature of the archives, of dust and redaction. "Your nib has stopped, Mr. Thorne," Thorne said, his voice low, a whisper that cut through the ambient noise of the court like a razor. "The record requires continuity. Do not let your personal reflections interrupt the flow of history." Elias kept his eyes on the page. "I am merely adjusting the ink, sir. The flow is intermittent today." "Is it?" Thorne leaned closer. Elias could feel the heat radiating from the man's body, could hear the slight rasp of his breath. "Or are you finding it difficult to commit certain sentiments to paper, sentiments that might complicate the narrative?" "The narrative is what is spoken, Mr. Thorne. You taught me that yourself." "I taught you that the law cares only for what is spoken aloud," Thorne corrected, his tone sharpening, losing its veneer of mentorship. "Not for what is whispered in the margins, not for the private journals of stenographers who think they understand the weight of the truths they carry." Clark's voice boomed again, drowning out the tension at the desk. "And so, gentlemen, we must ask ourselves, is it possible, is it probable, or is it merely a fantasy born of suspicion and a desire to find a villain where there is only tragedy?" The jury nodded, all 12 of them, in unison. Elias felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, a physical reaction to the sight of 12 minds closing simultaneously, shutting out the light of doubt. He dipped his pen, the ink dark and viscous, and forced his hand to move. He wrote Clark's words, he wrote the nods, he wrote the silence that followed. But he did not write the look Thorne gave him then, a glare of pure, unadulterated threat that promised retribution if the black notebook ever saw the light of day. He did not write the way his own fingers tightened around the pen, gripping it until the wood bit into his skin, a silent vow that he would not let the truth be scrubbed away, not while he still had breath to scratch it onto the page. Thorne straightened up, smoothing the front of his coat. "See that you finish the sentence, Mr. Thorne. The court waits for no man's hesitation." He walked away, merging into the shadows behind the judge's bench, disappearing like a ghost, retreating to its crypt. Elias exhaled, a long, shaky breath that fogged the air in front of him for a brief second before vanishing. He looked at Mrs. Bartlett. She had lifted her head now, her eyes meeting Clark's for a fleeting instant, a flash of something unreadable passing between them before she lowered her gaze once more. The prosecution had nothing left. The defense had the world, and Elias sat in the middle, his hand cramping, his pocket heavy with secrets, watching the machinery of justice grind to a halt, ready to spit out a verdict that everyone knew was already written in the stars, in the social codes, in the unspoken agreement that some vapors were too silent to ever be caught. Clark sat down. The rustle of his robes was the only sound in the room. Lord Chief Justice Coleridge adjusted his glasses, looking tired, the weight of the crown pressing down on his shoulders. He looked at the clock, then at the jury, then at the empty space where the prosecution's case used to stand. "Court will adjourn," he said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. "We shall reconvene tomorrow for the summing up." The gavel fell. The sound was final, a door slamming shut on a room full of ghosts. Elias closed his notebook. He slipped it into his coat, feeling the hard edges press against his heart, a reminder of the burden he had chosen to carry. He stood up, his legs stiff, and joined the flow of bodies moving towards the exit, stepping out into the corridor where the fog waited, thick and yellow, ready to swallow them all. Clark rose again, the silk of his gown whispering a dry friction against the oak bench, a sound like leaves skittering over a grave. He did not shout this time. The boom had served its purpose. Now came the needle, fine and sharp, stitching the jury's preconceptions into a verdict before the judge had even summed up. "Consider the mechanism," Clark said, his voice dropping to a conversational hum that forced the front row to lean in, straining their necks like pigeons seeking grain. "We are asked to believe that a slip of a woman, a creature of domestic refinement, wrestled a grown man into submission, that she held a saturated rag against his face while he slept, or perhaps while he struggled, without leaving a single bruise upon his wrist, not a tear in his nightshirt, not a mark upon his throat." He paced the floorboards, the wood groaning under his weight, stopping only when he stood directly before the jury box. The 12 men watched him, their faces slack, mouths slightly open as if waiting to be fed. "Chloroform is a volatile spirit," Clark continued, lifting a hand, fingers splayed to mimic the dispersal of vapor. "It burns, it stings the eyes, it triggers a violent, instinctive recall in any living soul. Are we to imagine Mrs. Bartlett possessed the strength of a prize fighter, the cold, surgical detachment of a butcher? That she could overpower a husband twice her size, hold him fast while his lungs screamed for air, and maintain that grip until the life fled him, all without a single cry waking the servants in the room below?" A murmur rippled through the gallery, low and approving. It was not the sound of people being convinced by logic. It was the sound of people having their prejudices validated. The baker nodded, a sharp jerk of his chin. The clerk beside him scratched his nose, his eyes drifting from Clark to the woman in the dock, measuring her slender wrists, the delicate curve of her neck, and finding them wanting in the capacity for violence. Elias' hand moved across the page, the shorthand symbols flowing in a dark river, capturing the rhythm of the lie, strength, detachment, impossible. He wrote the words, but his mind recoiled. He had seen women break men with less than physical force. He had seen silence wielded like a club. But the law, as Thorne had just reminded him, cared only for the spoken argument, for the theater of the probable, not the quiet truth of what might happen behind a locked door in Lambeth. "A woman's nature is to nurture, gentlemen, not to destroy," Clark intoned, spreading his arms wide, encompassing the entire room, the city beyond, the very structure of society itself. To suggest otherwise is to upend the natural order. It is to invite a chaos where the hearth becomes a battlefield and the wife a predator. Is this the England we know? Is this the reality we can accept? "No," someone whispered in the back, a single syllable, heavy with conviction. Elias paused. The nib hovered, a drop of ink swelling at the tip, threatening to fall and blot the page. He looked at Mrs. Bartlett. She sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, the black fabric of her dress absorbing the light. She did not smile. She did not weep. She simply existed within the shape Clark had carved for her, a vessel of innocent fragility, empty of guilt because she was too weak to hold it. It was a masterpiece. a construction so flawless it left no room for the chloroform bottle found in the house, no space for the stained handkerchief, no purchase for the science that said the poison was in the man's stomach. Clark had not disproved the evidence, he had simply made it incompatible with the idea of womanhood. The air in the court grew thick, pressurized by the weight of 12 minds closing rank. Elias could feel it in his chest, a tightening, a restriction of breath that mirrored the suffocation of the victim. He pressed the pen harder, the metal tip digging into the paper, tearing a tiny furrow in the fiber. He wanted to write down the smell of the room, the sour tang of nervous sweat mixing with the gaslight, the way the dust motes danced in the beams like tiny, chaotic stars. He wanted to record the look in the prosecutor's eyes, a dull resignation, the acknowledgement that he had lost the battle before it began because he was fighting chemistry against theology. But Thorne's warning hung in the air, invisible yet suffocating. Do not let your personal reflections interrupt the flow. Elias forced his hand to relax. He wrote the question. He wrote the rhetorical flourish. He omitted the tremor in Clark's voice that suggested even the advocate knew he was selling a fantasy, a comforting story to protect the jury from the terrifying notion that evil could wear a skirt and speak with a soft voice. And so, Clark concluded, his voice dropping to a whisper that carried to the furthest corner of the gallery, I ask you to look at this woman, look at her, and tell me if you see a murderer, or if you see merely a widow broken by loss, persecuted by a system that cannot comprehend how a man might die without a mark upon his skin. He sat down. The movement was final, a period at the end of a long, declarative sentence. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was not empty, it was heavy, laden with the verdict that had already been decided in the hearts of the 12 men. The prosecutor remained seated, his papers shuffled into a neat pile, his head bowed. There would be no rebuttal. There was nothing left to say against an argument that appealed not to the evidence, but to the soul of the age. Lord Chief Justice Coleridge shifted in his high chair, the leather creaking under the movement. He adjusted his spectacles, peering down at the court through the thick lenses, his expression one of weary resignation. He looked at the clock on the wall, then at the jury, and finally at the woman in the dock. There was no anger in his face, no frustration at the cleverness of the defense. Only a tired acceptance that the law was a human construct, bound by the same limitations and biases as the men who administered it. Court will adjourn, the judge said, his voice flat, stripping the moment of any lingering drama. We shall reconvene tomorrow for the summing up. The gavel struck. The crack of wood on wood echoed through the chamber, sharp and absolute, severing the proceedings from the day. Elias closed his book. The leather cover felt warm under his palm, heated by the friction of his writing. He slipped it into his inner pocket, the edges pressing against his ribs, a hard, secret weight that anchored him to the floor while the rest of the room began to stir. Around him, the gallery erupted into motion, chairs scraping, coats rustling, voices rising in a babble of opinion and speculation. She'll be cleared, a man said loudly near the door. No woman could do it. Clark showed them plain. Poor soul, a woman replied, her voice thick with manufactured pity. To be accused of such a thing, it's a disgrace. Elias stood, his legs stiff from hours of sitting in the cramped alcove. He adjusted his coat, ensuring the notebook was hidden deep within the folds, safe from prying eyes and redacting hands. He looked once more at the dock. Mrs. Bartlett was rising, assisted by a clerk, her movements slow, deliberate, maintaining the performance of fragility until the very last second. She did not look at Elias. She did not look at Thorne. She looked only at Clark, and in that brief, fleeting glance, there was something that chilled the blood more than any confession ever could. It was not gratitude, it was acknowledgement. Elias turned away, joining the stream of bodies flowing towards the exit. The corridor awaited, with its damp stone walls and the smell of wet wool and tobacco smoke. The fog outside would be thick, yellow, and choking, wrapping the city in a blanket that hid secrets just as effectively as the walls of the Old Bailey. He stepped into the flow, one more ghost in the machine, carrying the truth in his pocket, walking into the grey afternoon where the vapors of the city waited to swallow him whole. The crush of bodies in the corridor acted as a sieve, separating the legal fraternity from the gawping public, and Elias found himself pinned against the damp limestone wall by a surge of barristers eager to escape the stifling air of the courtroom. "Step aside, boy." A shoulder drove into his sternum, hard bone meeting ribs, shoving him back into the shadow of a recessed alcove where the gas jets hissed with a sickly yellow flame. Elias stumbled, his heel catching on the uneven flagstones, but he did not fall. He clamped a hand over his left breast, fingers digging into the wool of his coat to ensure the notebook remained buried beneath the fabric, safe from the jostling elbows of men who believed the law was a game won by volume rather than precision. The smell here was different from the court. Less tobacco, more wet dog, and the sharp, ammoniac tang of urine that rose from the grates in the corner, a scent that spoke of the building's age and the thousands of desperate souls who had passed through its throat. "Elias." The voice cut through the din, low and dry as parchment rubbed together. It did not shout. It did not need to. Elias Thorne stood 3 paces away, having slipped free from the judge's retinue with the silent efficiency of a man who knew every secret passage in the edifice. He wore his black silk gown over his shoulders like a shroud, the heavy fabric swallowing the light, and his face was a mask of pale, drawn tension that made him look older than the stones surrounding them. Elias straightened his collar, trying to mask the rapid thudding of his pulse. "Mr. Thorne." "You linger." Thorne stepped closer, invading the small circle of personal space Elias had managed to carve out against the wall. His eyes, gray and watery behind thick spectacles, dropped to Elias' chest, lingering on the slight bulge beneath the coat lapel. "And you protect something with excessive care." "The official transcript is complete, sir. Every word of Mr. Clark's summation is captured." "Do not mistake the scratch of your nib for the voice of conscience, Miss Hale. The law cares only for what is spoken aloud, not what is whispered in the margins." Thorne's hand shot out, fingers long and spider-thin, grasping Elias' wrist with a grip that belied his frail appearance. "Give it to me." The command hung in the stagnant air, absolute and terrifying. Around them, the crowd flowed like a river around a stone, oblivious to the struggle happening in the eddy of the alcove. A group of clerks laughed nearby, discussing their evening plans at the Cheshire Cheese, their voices bright and careless, a stark contrast to the deadly seriousness of the moment. Elias looked at the hand on his wrist. He could feel the heat of Thorne's skin, dry and feverish, transmitting a silent urgency that had nothing to do with procedure and everything to do with fear. This was not about accuracy. This was about containment. Thorne wanted the black book because it contained the things the official record would never show: the tremor in the widow's voice, the calculated pause before a lie, the way the jury leaned forward when science failed them and turned instead to prejudice. "It is my private notation," Elias said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his limbs. "It is not for the crown. It is a liability." Thorne's grip tightened, nails biting into the flesh above the pulse point. "There are sentiments in this court today that must not be preserved. The defense has played upon the jury's biases, yes, but to record the mechanism of that manipulation, to write down how we allowed gender to supersede chemistry, that is not journalism, Elias. That is sedition against the dignity of the bench." "The truth is not sedition." "The truth is messy." Thorne yanked him forward, bringing their faces inches apart. Elias could smell the peppermint on his breath, a cloying sweetness that did nothing to mask the underlying odor of stale coffee and anxiety. "We are here to administer the law, not to dissect the soul of the age for the amusement of future historians. If that book leaves this building with those observations intact, you will find yourself without a position before the sun rises tomorrow. And I assure you, Mrs. Gable's letters to your employer are already waiting on a desk in Fleet Street. Do not think I have been idle." The threat landed with the weight of a physical blow. Mrs. Gable, the landlady with her cold coal and her fervent belief that a woman's place was far from the dock of the Old Bailey. Thorne had not just watched, he had conspired. He had woven a net of domestic and professional pressure, tightening the noose from both ends to ensure compliance. Elias looked past Thorne's shoulder, watching the double doors of the courtroom swing shut as the last of the jury filed out, escorted by ushers who moved with military precision. Somewhere beyond those doors, Ad A tilde copyright La tilde de Bartlett was being led back to her cell, perhaps believing she was safe, perhaps knowing exactly how thoroughly she had manipulated the men who held her fate in their hands. If he handed over the book, the redaction would begin immediately. Thorne would scrape the ink from the page or simply tear the leaves out, leaving a gap in the history that would never be filled. The narrative would remain clean: a tragic widow, a mysterious death, a legal system that worked. The uncomfortable reality that a woman could kill with a handkerchief and walk free because the world refused to believe her capable of such cold calculation would be erased. "No," Elias said. The word was small, barely a whisper, but it carried a finality that made Thorne's eyes widen behind the thick lenses. "You misunderstand your position," Thorne hissed, his composure cracking to reveal the panic beneath. "You are a functionary, a tool. You do not get to decide what is remembered." "I am the one who writes it down." Elias twisted his wrist, breaking the grip with a sudden, sharp motion that left red marks on his skin. He stepped back, pressing his spine hard against the cold stone, shielding the pocket with his arm. "If you wish to take it, you will have to tear it from my coat, and the noise will bring the ushers. Do you want that scene, Mr. Thorne? Do you want the gallery to see the chief clerk assaulting a stenographer in the corridor?" Thorne froze, his hand hovered in the air, fingers curled as if still grasping the fabric. The logic of the court, the very system he sought to protect, had become Elias' shield. A scene here would draw attention, and attention was the one thing Thorne desperately wanted to avoid. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The gas jet above them flickered, casting dancing shadows across Thorne's face, turning his expression into a shifting mask of rage and calculation. Then, slowly, the hand dropped to his side. "This is not over," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a venomous murmur. "Tomorrow, when the summing up begins, you will write only what is dictated. If I see your pen hesitate, if I see you scribbling in that infernal cipher during the judge's speech, I will have you removed before the lunch hour, and I will ensure no court in London ever employs you again." He adjusted his gown, smoothing the silk with trembling hands, reclaiming his dignity by force of will. "The judge expects a clean record, Elias. Do not disappoint him." Thorne turned and walked away, merging into the flow of black robes and grey suits, disappearing into the crowd as if he had never been there at all. Elias exhaled, the breath leaving his lungs in a long, shuddering rush that he had been holding since the moment Thorne spoke his name. He pressed his hand against the pocket again, feeling the hard edges of the notebook through the wool. It was still there. The truth was still his. But the victory felt hollow, tainted by the knowledge that Thorne's threat regarding Mrs. Gable was likely no bluff. The net was closing, tightening from the home front and the professional sphere alike. He pushed off the wall, his legs feeling heavy, as if the stone floor had grown sticky and resistant. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of the building and into the fog before Thorne could change his mind or send an usher to detain him on some fabricated charge. Elias moved towards the exit, keeping his head down, his arm clamped tight against his side. The heavy oak doors loomed ahead, guarded by an usher who nodded respectfully as he approached, unaware of the battle just fought in the shadows. As Elias stepped out onto the pavement, the cold air hit him like a physical blow, biting through his coat and stealing the warmth from his cheeks. The fog had thickened since morning, a yellow soup that swallowed the street lamps and reduced the passing hansom cabs to ghostly shapes moving silently through the gloom. He pulled his collar up, turning towards the river, but stopped. Standing under the awning of a news vendor's stall, sheltering from the damp mist, was a figure in a dark bonnet. She was not looking at the papers. She was looking directly at him. "Mrs. Gable." She held a folded letter in her gloved hand, white against the black fabric of her dress, and as their eyes met across the swirling vapor, she did not smile. She simply raised the letter slightly, a silent signal that the post had been sent, the trap laid, and that his sanctuary in Bloomsbury was no longer his own. Elias gripped the notebook in his pocket, the paper feeling suddenly fragile, and realized the trial in the courtroom was over, but the trial for his own life had just begun. The clock on the western wall did not tick, it gnawed. Each second dragged its iron weight across the silence of court number 1, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to grind against the raw nerve of every man and woman packed into the gallery. Elias Thorne sat hunched in his alcove, the wood of the desk biting into his forearms, his pen hovering above the fresh sheet of paper like a bird, unsure whether to land or flee. The inkwell beside him had stopped steaming, the heat of the day leaching away into the damp brickwork, leaving only the cold, metallic scent of dried gallnuts and the lingering, cloying odor of unwashed wool from the crowd above. That was the only instruction the law offered now. The jury had withdrawn 10 minutes ago, or perhaps an hour. Time inside the Old Bailey possessed a viscosity all its own, thickening when fear was present, thinning when blood was spilled. Elias dipped his nib, the movement automatic, a nervous tick that left a solitary, bloated drop of black on the margin of the official log. He did not blot it. There was nothing to record but the absence of speech, and the law had no shorthand for holding one's breath. Above him, the gas jets hissed, a soft, serpentine sound that competed with the clock's devouring rhythm. The flames flickered behind their globes, casting long, wavering shadows that stretched up the dark oak paneling to where the judges' benches sat empty, high and inaccessible as altar steps. Somewhere in the robing room beyond those doors, 12 men were arguing over the nature of vapor, debating whether a liquid could kill without a hand to force it down a throat, whether a wife could murder a husband without leaving a bruise on the skin or a stain on the conscience. Elias shifted his weight, the chair creaking under the strain of his stillness. His left leg had gone numb, pins and needles pricking through the boot, but he dared not stand. To move was to draw attention, and Elias Thorne's warning from the corridor still burned in his ears, hotter than the gaslight. "You are a functionary." The words felt less like a reprimand and more like a sentence, a reduction of his entire existence to the scratch of a nib, a mechanical process designed to filter out the truth and retain only the procedure. He glanced towards the dock. Ad A tilde copyright La tilde de Bartlett sat alone on the hard bench, her hands folded in her lap with a precision that suggested they had been placed there by someone else. She wore black, of course, the heavy crepe absorbing the dim light, but it was her stillness that unnerved him. While the gallery murmured, shifting feet and whispering prayers, while the clerks shuffled papers and the ushers leaned heavily against their staves, she remained utterly motionless. Her eyes were fixed on the door through which the jury had vanished, yet she did not seem to be waiting for a verdict. She looked as though she were listening to something far away, something the rest of them were too deaf to hear. A man in the row behind Elias cleared his throat, a harsh, wet sound that echoed like a pistol shot in the quiet. 10 minutes, he whispered to his neighbor, the words carrying clearly in the acoustic trap of the room. They'll not be long. The judge summed up against her, didn't he? Coleridge made it plain enough. Hush, the neighbor replied, though his own neck craned forward, eager for the spectacle of a hanging. Let them decide. Science is a tricky beast. You cannot hang a woman on a bottle of spirits unless you can prove she poured it. But the smell, the first man insisted, leaning closer, his breath smelling of stale tobacco and onions. The neighbors said the house stank of it for days. How does a house stink of chloroform if the woman didn't spill it? Elias pressed his pen harder into the paper, the metal tines scratching a groove into the fiber. He wanted to turn, to tell them that smell was not evidence, that vapor was a ghost that vanished before it could be weighed or measured, but he kept his gaze forward. To speak was to break the seal of the court, to step out of the role of the invisible scribe and into the light where Elias Thorne could see him. And Thorne was watching. The chief clerk stood near the judge's bench, ostensibly organizing a stack of briefs, but his posture was rigid, his eyes sweeping the room with the predatory focus of a hawk. When his gaze passed over Elias' alcove, it lingered for a fraction of a second, a silent reminder of the threat hanging over the stenographer's head. Write only what is dictated. The instruction was a cage, and Elias could feel the bars closing in, restricting not just his hand, but his very capacity to perceive. If he wrote only the spoken word, then the tremor in Mrs. Bartlett's voice, the calculated pause before her answers, the way her eyes never quite met her counsel, all of it would be lost, edited out of history before the ink was dry. The clock gnawed, another minute away. 15 minutes, 20. The gas jets seemed to burn brighter as the natural light outside the high windows faded, the yellow fog of London pressing against the glass, shutting out the world of Pimlico and the river beyond. Inside, the air grew heavier, saturated with the sweat of 300 people waiting for permission to exhale. Elias wiped a bead of perspiration from his upper lip, the moisture cold against his skin. He thought of the black notebook in his inner pocket, the one sealers had tried to tear from him. It felt heavy against his ribs, a secret weight that threatened to unbalance him. What was the use of writing the truth there, in a cipher no one would ever read, if the public record remained a lie? Was truth merely a private comfort, a way to soothe one's own conscience while the world marched on in error? The handle of the jury door turned. The sound was slight, a mere click of brass against wood, but it ripped through the court like a thunderclap. Every head snapped towards the sound. The murmuring died instantly, strangled in 100 throats. The ushers straightened, their staves thumping against the floor in unison, a dull, wooden rhythm that signaled the return of order. Elias Thorne stepped forward, his face a mask of practiced neutrality, though Elias noticed the way his fingers tightened on the edge of the bench, the knuckles whitening beneath the silk of his gloves. The jury filed in, their faces flushed, some avoiding the gaze of the prisoner, others staring at her with a mixture of pity and revulsion. They took their seats, the rustle of their coats loud in the sudden, suffocating quiet. Lord Chief Justice Coleridge resumed his seat, his wig slightly askew, his expression unreadable. He looked down at the foreman, a stout man with a red face who seemed to be struggling with the weight of the paper in his hand. "Have you reached a verdict?" Coleridge asked. His voice was dry, devoid of inflection, as if he were inquiring about the weather rather than the fate of a woman accused of poisoning her husband. The foreman stood. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and uncomfortable. He looked at the judge, then at the jury box, and finally, reluctantly, at Mrs. Bartlett. "We have, my lord," he said. His voice lacked the boom of authority one expected from such a moment. It was thin, reedy, as though he were apologizing for the inconvenience. "On the count of murder, we find the defendant not guilty." The words hung in the air, suspended in the dust motes dancing in the gaslight. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The court seemed to stall, the machinery of justice jamming on the unexpected output. Then a roar erupted from the gallery, a surge of noise that hit the vaulted ceiling and bounced back down, chaotic and jubilant. Men cheered, clapping their hands, while women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs, relieved that the spectacle would end without the grim finale of the drop. Elias did not move. He sat frozen, his pen still poised over the paper, the words "not guilty" forming in his mind, even as his hand refused to commit them to the page. The legal absolution felt hollow, a technicality that washed over the facts without cleansing them. They had not said she was innocent. They had only said the Crown had failed to explain the impossible. Through the din, Elias watched the dock. Mrs. Bartlett did not smile. She did not weep. She did not even stand to acknowledge the cheers that were being shouted in her name. She remained seated, her hands still folded in her lap, her face a mask of such profound emptiness that it chilled him more than any display of triumph could have. It was the look of a person who had stepped out of a room and found the house burned down, who realized that survival was its own kind of sentence. Elias Thorne moved quickly, cutting through the celebrating crowd to reach the clerk's table. He began gathering the official transcripts, his movements sharp and efficient, stacking the papers into a neat pile that obscured the notes Elias had taken. As he reached for the top sheet, his eyes locked with Elias. There was no warmth in the look, no shared relief. Only a cold, hard warning that passed between them like a coin in a dark alley. "Remember your place," the glance said. "The record is what I say it is. Your private thoughts stay in the dark, or you join the destitute on the embankment." Thorne turned away, clutching the papers to his chest as if they were holy relics, and began to usher the judge towards the exit. The crowd was surging now, eager to spill out into the street and spread the news, to dissect the verdict over gin and beer, to rewrite the afternoon's tension into a story of justice served. Elias remained in his alcove, the noise washing over him without touching him. He felt detached, as though he were viewing the scene from a great distance, through the wrong end of a telescope. The victory belonged to Sir Edward Clarke, whose voice boomed from the floor as he accepted the congratulations of his peers. It belonged to the jury, who could now go home to their dinners. It even belonged to Elias Thorne, who had preserved the reputation of the court. But it did not belong to the truth. Elias finally lowered his pen, the ink drying on the nib before he could write the final line. He watched as Mrs. Bartlett stood, assisted by a matron who whispered something urgently in her ear. The widow nodded, a small mechanical movement, and turned to leave the dock. She moved slowly, her black skirts sweeping the floor, her eyes fixed on the aisle that led to freedom. As she passed the clerk's table, her pace did not falter, but her hand dipped slightly, a gesture so subtle it might have been a tremor. Something white fluttered from her fingers, drifting down through the dusty air to land on the floorboards directly beside Elias' foot. A handkerchief, fine lace, edged with black silk. The crowd pushed forward, blocking her from view, sweeping her out into the corridor before Elias could call out. He looked down at the scrap of fabric lying in the shadow of his desk. Around him, the court emptied, the cheers fading into the distance, leaving only the hiss of the gas and the gnawing of the clock. He bent down, his fingers trembling slightly as he reached for the lace, and as he lifted it, the scent rose to meet him, cutting through the smell of stale tobacco and old wood. It was faint but unmistakable, sweet, chemical, pungent. Chloroform. The scent did not fade. It clung to the lace, a ghost of the very substance that had stopped Thomas Bartlett's heart, now resting in Elias' palm like an accusation wrapped in silk. He crushed the handkerchief, the fine fabric balling up against his skin, trapping the volatile spirit before it could dissipate into the stale air of the courtroom. A mistake. To hold evidence was to invite ruin, to smell it was to become complicit, yet he could not drop it. The chemical sweetness cut through the reek of unwashed bodies and damp wool that the departing crowd had left behind, sharp and medicinal, a smell that belonged in a surgeon's cabinet, not on the person of a grieving widow walking free. "Leave it." Elias Thorne's voice came from above, low and devoid of the triumph that animated the rest of the hall. He had returned, having successfully shepherded Lord Chief Justice Coleridge through the side door, and now stood over Elias' alcove, his shadow stretching long across the scattered papers. Thorne did not look at the handkerchief. He looked at Elias' hand, then at Elias' eyes, his expression flat, a mask of bureaucratic exhaustion that hid whatever calculation churned beneath. "It fell," Elias said. His own voice sounded rough, scraped raw from hours of silence and the dust of the gallery. He did not open his fist. From her sleeve, as she passed. "Things fall in court every day, Mr. Thorne. Ribbons, gloves, dignity." Thorne leaned in, placing a heavy hand on the edge of the clerk's table. The wood groaned under the pressure. "Pick up nothing that does not belong to the crown. That is the rule. You know the rule better than most, given your penchant for supplementary records." Elias felt the lace dig into his palm, the black silk edge biting into his skin. The warning was clear, delivered with the precision of a scalpel. Thorne knew, he always knew. The chief clerk's eyes darted to the small, leather-bound book tucked beneath Elias' official transcript, the black notebook where the true weights and measures of the day were kept, far from the sanitized language of the official record. "She dropped it for a reason," Elias muttered, the words slipping out before he could check them. It was a dangerous thing to say, implying intent where the law had just declared none existed. Thorne's lips thinned. Mrs. Bartlett is a woman who has just been handed her life back by the mercy of 12 men who could not fathom the science presented to them. She is likely disoriented, hysterical, even. Do not construct narratives where there are only accidents, Elias. The press will do enough of that without your assistance. "It smells of chloroform sealers." The name hung in the air between them, stripping away the formal titles that usually armored their interactions. Thorne flinched, a microscopic tightening of the jaw that betrayed the crack in his composure. He straightened up, pulling his hand from the table as if the wood had burned him. Around them, the ushers were extinguishing the gas, jets one by one, plunging sections of the court into gloom, the hissing of the valves sounding like snakes retreating into grass. "Then it smells of the hospital where her husband died," Thorne said, his voice dropping to a whisper that barely carried over the scrape of chairs being stacked. It smells of the bottle the police found on the mantelpiece. It smells of nothing but a tragedy that has already been adjudicated. Do not breathe it in too deeply, or you will begin to see ghosts where there are only widows. He reached out not to take the handkerchief, but to cover Elias' clenched fist with his own large, cold hand. The gesture was almost paternal, yet it carried the weight of a vice. Burn it. When you return to your lodgings, burn it and burn the page in your black book, where you will inevitably write down that you held it. The world requires a verdict, Elias. It does not require the messy, unprovable truth that lingers on a piece of lace. Elias looked up at him. The gaslight above flickered, casting Thorne's face into sharp relief, highlighting the deep lines of worry etched around his mouth. This was not merely about protecting the court's reputation, it was about survival. Thorne believed, truly believed, that acknowledging the scent would unravel something fundamental, that the fragile peace of the city depended on accepting the legal fiction over the chemical reality. "And if I keep it?" Elias asked. The question was quiet, barely a whisper, but it struck the space between them with the force of a shout. Thorne removed his hand. He stepped back, adjusting his waistcoat, smoothing the fabric as if to erase the contact. "Then you are a fool, and fools do not last long in the shadow of the Old Bailey. They end up in the workhouse or worse, writing confessions in penny dreadfuls while starving in a garret." He turned to go, his boots clicking sharply on the flagstones. "Go home, Elias. The court is closed. The case is finished. Let the dead bury their dead." He walked away, his figure receding into the dimness of the corridor, leaving Elias alone in the shrinking circle of light. The ushers had moved further down the row, extinguishing the jet above the jury box, then the one over the dock. Darkness crept inward, swallowing the empty seats where the spectators had sat, the table where the prosecution had failed, the spot where Mrs. Bartlett had sat without blinking. Elias looked down at his hand. The lace was still there, bunched in his fist, the scent rising again as the warmth of his grip revitalized the volatile liquid trapped in the fibers. It was sweet, cloying, a sickly perfume that spoke of sleep induced by force, of a husband gasping for air while his wife watched. He thought of Thomas Bartlett, lying in that room in Lambeth, the chloroform soaked into a rag pressed against his face, the struggle silent, invisible, leaving no mark on the throat for the doctors to find. "Not guilty." The words echoed in his mind, hollow and useless. The law had spoken, but the chemistry remained. The scent on the handkerchief was the only testimony that mattered now, the only proof that would never be entered into evidence, never cross-examined, never weighed by a jury. It was a secret shared between a murderer and the man who wrote it down, a burden heavier than any verdict. He opened his other hand and smoothed the lace flat against the desk. In the failing light, the black silk edging looked like a bruise. He took his pen, dipped it into the inkwell, and opened the black notebook to a fresh page. The official transcript was finished, signed, and sealed away in Thorne's pile. This was for the margins. This was for the truth that had no place in the record. "She dropped it," he wrote, the nib scratching loudly in the quiet room. "It smells of the vapor. She knows I know." He paused, the ink pooling at the tip of the pen. Outside, the heavy doors of the court were being barred for the night, the thud of the bolts sounding final, like a coffin lid closing. London waited beyond those doors, a city of fog and gaslight, ready to celebrate the innocence of a woman who carried the smell of death in her pocket. Elias capped the pen and slipped the handkerchief into his waistcoat pocket, right next to his heart. He would not burn it, not tonight, perhaps not ever. Standing up, he blew out the candle on his desk, plunging his alcove into total darkness. He felt his way towards the aisle, his hand resting on the pocket where the lace lay hidden, a small, sweet poison against his ribs. The silence of the court was absolute now, but in his head, the hiss of the gas jets continued, a constant, mocking reminder that some things, once released, could never be truly contained. He stepped out into the corridor, the darkness swallowing him whole, carrying the secret out into the London night. The corridor air tasted of wet stone and extinguished wicks, a cold draft sweeping from the main doors that carried the distant rumble of cabs on the cobbles outside. Elias moved through the gloom, his fingers tracing the rough brickwork to guide him, the handkerchief in his pocket burning against his side like a coal wrapped in silk. He reached the heavy oak doors leading to the street, pushed one open, and stepped into the London night. Fog clung to the pavement, thick and yellow, swallowing the gas lamps so they appeared as mere halos of sickly light suspended in the void. The crowd had not dispersed. They clustered on the steps and spilled onto the road, a surging mass of hats and shawls, their voices rising in a chaotic hymn to acquittal. Men waved their hats, women wept openly, clutching each other's arms as if the verdict had saved them all from some shared, unnamed doom. "She's free," a man shouted, his face flushed with beer and triumph, grabbing Elias' sleeve in his excitement. "Did you hear? Not guilty. The Crown couldn't prove a thing." Elias pulled his arm free, stepping back into the shadow of the doorway. "The Crown proved plenty," he said, his voice flat, lost in the din. "The jury simply chose not to see it." The man laughed, a sharp, barking sound, and turned away to join the throng pressing towards a carriage waiting at the curb. The horses stamped, their breath pluming in the chill, hooves striking sparks from the stones. Inside the carriage, visible through the window for a fleeting second, sat Mrs. Bartlett. She wore her black weeds, the veil lifted slightly, her profile sharp and pale against the dark interior. She did not wave. She did not smile at the cheering mob that had just granted her life back. She looked straight ahead, her eyes fixed on some point beyond the fog, beyond the city, beyond the reach of the law. A woman near Elias sniffed loudly, wiping her nose with a gloved hand before murmuring to her companion, "Poor creature." To think they accused her of such a thing, a lady like that, it felt unnatural, dragging a wife into court like a common thief. "Unnatural indeed," her companion agreed, tightening her shawl. "Though I hear the husband was a strange man, kept to himself. Maybe he took the stuff himself. Despair, you know, men do foolish things when despair takes hold." "They say she administered it," the first woman whispered, leaning in until her voice dropped to a conspiratorial hiss that carried perfectly in the damp air. "But without proof, what can anyone say? The law requires proof. Thank God for Sir Edward Clarke, who saved her from the hangman's noose." Elias turned away from them, the sweetness of the chloroform in his pocket seeming to intensify, reacting to the cold air, rising through the layers of his waistcoat and shirt until he could taste it on the back of his tongue. It was a phantom flavor, chemical and sharp, contrasting with the stale beer and roast chestnut smells of the crowd. He walked down the steps, keeping to the edge of the pavement, avoiding the press of bodies that sought to touch the hem of the carriage as it began to move. The wheels groaned, biting into the mud of the street, and the carriage lurched forward, slowly making its way through the celebrating throng. People cheered louder, reaching out, some trying to run alongside, their boots slipping on the wet stones. Elias stood still, watching the vehicle disappear into the fog, its lanterns fading until they were nothing but two ghostly eyes blinking in the gloom. "Going home, sir," a policeman stepped out of the mist, his helmet gleaming dull under the lamp. He looked tired, his truncheon hanging loose at his side, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of disorder. "Best be careful. Crowds like this can turn ugly quick. Drink makes men bold, and disappointment makes them violent." "There is no disappointment tonight, officer," Elias said, watching the last trace of the carriage vanish. "Only a different kind of violence, the quiet sort." The policeman frowned, shifting his weight. "Quiet sort? Don't know what you mean by that, sir. Verdicts given, cases closed, folks are happy, that's enough for me." "Is it?" Elias asked. He touched his pocket again, feeling the lace through the wool. "What happens to the truth when the court goes home? Does it stay in the building, or does it walk out with us?" The officer chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Truth is what the judge says it is, sir. Rest is just chatter. You've been inside too long, breathing all that ink and dust. Get yourself a brandy, warm your belly, forget the rest." "Forget," Elias repeated, the word tasting ash dry on his tongue. Yes, that seemed to be the order of the day. He walked past the policeman, heading away from the Old Bailey, away from the cheering crowd, towards the darker streets of Bloomsbury. The fog thickened as he moved, wrapping around his legs, muffling the sound of his boots. Behind him, the cheers faded, replaced by the rhythmic clip-clop of distant horses and the low murmur of the city settling back into its nightly routine. But the silence in his own head remained loud, filled with the scratching of his nib, the hiss of the gas jets, and the sweet, cloying scent that refused to fade. He reached the corner where the street lamp flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the brick walls. A stray dog skulked in the gutter, ribs showing through its matted fur, sniffing at a discarded crust of bread. It looked up at Elias, eyes reflecting the gaslight, then darted away into the alley as he approached. Everything here was scavenging, surviving, making do with the scraps left behind by the powerful. Elias stopped under the lamp and took the handkerchief from his pocket. He held it up to the light. The lace was intricate, delicate, a piece of craftsmanship that spoke of money and care, now stained with the invisible residue of a crime that would never be punished. He brought it to his nose, inhaling deeply. The scent was stronger now, unmasked by the court's formal atmosphere, raw and undeniable. It smelled of sleep. It smelled of ending. A window opened above him, and a woman leaned out, shaking a rug. Dust billowed down, catching in the light, swirling around Elias like a miniature storm. "Keep moving, love," she called down, her voice rough with fatigue. "No loitering. Police don't like it, and neither do I." "Just passing through," Elias said, folding the handkerchief carefully and returning it to his pocket. "Just carrying a little history home with me." "History's heavy," the woman muttered, pulling the window shut with a bang. "Best leave it where it belongs." He resumed walking, his steps falling in time with the ticking of the court clock that still echoed in his memory. Tick-tock, tick-tock. While each stride carried him further from the verdict, it drew him closer to the truth he now carried alone. The fog pressed in to dampen the world, turning the familiar streets of London into a labyrinth of grey uncertainty. Somewhere ahead, Mrs. Bartlett was arriving at her house in Lambeth, stepping onto her own pavement before unlocking her door and walking into the room where her husband had died. And somewhere behind, the Old Bailey stood dark and silent, its records sealed, its justice served, its secrets kept. Elias touched his pocket one last time, ensuring the lace was safe. He would write more tonight. He would fill pages with what he knew, with what he smelled, with what he saw in the empty eyes of the acquitted. Let Thorne warn him. Let the police dismiss him. Let the crowd cheer for fiction. He had the vapor. He had the scent. And in the quiet of his room, with the gaslight low and the door locked, he would make sure that at least one record remained unburned. The street narrowed ahead, the buildings leaning in as if to whisper. Elias walked into the darkness, the sweet smell rising again, a constant companion in the silent night. Mud sucked at the soles of his boots, each step releasing a wet smack against the cobbles that echoed louder than the distant shouting from the courtroom doors. Elias kept his collar turned up, not against the cold, but to hide the lower half of his face from anyone who might have sat in the gallery hours before. 10 yards ahead, a figure in black silk detached itself from the cluster of reporters near the curb. She moved without haste, her skirts sweeping the grit from the pavement in a rhythmic whisper that cut through the clatter of iron-shod hooves. He stopped. A hansom cab rattled past, spraying filthy water against the wall, and he pressed his back into the brickwork to avoid the splash. Mrs. Bartlett did not look left or right. She carried a small reticule clutched against her stomach, fingers white against the dark fabric, as if holding herself together against the wind. Elias pushed off the wall. To follow her felt like an intrusion, a violation of the invisible boundary the verdict had drawn between the public record and the private woman, yet his feet moved before his conscience could intervene. He needed to see where the law had sent her. A street seller nearby shook out a bundle of evening papers, the newsprint still damp from the presses. "Extra, extra, Bartlett acquittal, all the details inside." The man's voice cracked on the high note, desperate for coppers. Elias ignored him, eyes fixed on the widow's back. She reached the rank where 3 cabs waited, horses steaming in the chill air, their breath pluming like the vapor that had killed Thomas Bartlett. One of the drivers leaned down from his box, pipe smoke curling around his hat brim. "Cab, ma'am." "Lambeth Road," she said, her voice carried clearly, devoid of tremor. "And drive quickly." The driver spat into the gutter. "Fares double this hour, ma'am. Fog's thick as wool out by the bridge. Horses can't see their own noses." "Pay him," she said, not to the driver, but to the man who had stepped forward from the shadows to assist her. A solicitor's clerk, perhaps, or a hired escort. The man nodded, fumbling for coins. Elias halted behind a water cart. The wood of the barrel leaked, creating a small dark pool that reflected the gas lamp above. He watched the clerk hand over the money. Mrs. Bartlett stepped into the cab. The door shut with a solid click, sealing her inside the leather and glass box. She did not look back at the court. She did not look at the crowd. She simply disappeared into the interior, leaving the exterior world to deal with the mess. The cab lurched forward, wheels groaning over the stones. Elias waited until the tail lights faded into the grey suspension of the street before he moved again. His chest felt tight, not from exertion, but from the weight of the knowledge sitting in his pocket. The handkerchief burned against his thigh, a secret weight heavier than the lace suggested. He had followed her to the edge of the law's jurisdiction, and now she was gone, returned to the house where the chemistry of death had been brewed. A policeman stood on the corner, watching the flow of traffic with bored eyes. He glanced at Elias, noting the ink stains on his cuffs, the weary slump of his shoulders. "Moving along, sir. Court's closed." "Just walking," Elias said. His voice sounded rough, unused. "Best keep to the main thoroughfares. Pickpockets love this fog, and mourners." The officer tapped his truncheon against his leg. "People get strange ideas when verdicts don't match their feelings, might mistake you for someone else." "I am no one of consequence." "Aren't we all?" The policeman turned away, signaling to a drayman blocking the lane. Elias pulled his coat tighter. The officer's words hung in the air, trivial yet sharp. "Might mistake you for someone else." In the eyes of the crowd, he was merely another man in a hat, yet inside his head, he carried the transcript of a crime that had not happened, according to the Crown. He walked past the water cart, the smell of wet horse and stale urine rising to meet him. The city did not care about chloroform. It cared about warmth, about food, about getting home before the gas ran low. He turned the corner towards Fleet Street. The fog here was denser, clinging to the buildings like a second skin of grime. Gas jets hissed overhead, their light diffused into weak halos that failed to penetrate the gloom. Somewhere in this same fog, Mrs. Bartlett was traveling south, towards Lambeth, towards the bedroom with the red brick facade. Did she feel relief, or did she feel the absence of the husband she had allegedly loved? The official record said she wept. His notebook said she stared at the floor. A woman selling matches stepped out from a doorway, holding a tray against her chest. "Buy a box, sir, just a penny, for the little ones." Elias stopped. He looked at the matches, small wooden sticks tipped with sulfur. Fire, destruction, evidence. "No," he said, "I have no light to spare." "Everyone needs light, sir, even in the day." "Not today." He walked past her, hearing her sigh behind him, a sound of resignation that matched his own. Street narrowed, the buildings leaning in as if to whisper secrets to one another. Elias kept his pace steady, resisting the urge to run. Running would draw attention. Running would suggest guilt. He was a stenographer, a man of ink and paper, not a detective or a hunter. Yet here he was, stalking a widow through the London night. He touched his pocket again. The lace was still there. The scent was still there. It smelled of almonds and sleep, a perfume that did not belong on a living woman's skin. He reached the junction where the road split towards Bloomsbury. To the left lay his lodgings, Mrs. Gable's cold fireplace, the safety of anonymity. To the right lay the river, the path towards Lambeth, the path she had taken. He stood at the crossroads, feet planted on the wet pavement, undecided. The fog swirled around his knees, obscuring the way forward. A carriage passed, the lamps swinging. The driver cursed at a stray dog that darted under the wheels. "Get on, you brute, want to be crushed." The dog yelped and vanished into the alley, leaving Elias to watch it go. While survival was a simple thing for a dog, reducible to run or die, for a man it was far more complex, involving choices about truth, about duty, and about the cost of knowing too much. He thought of Elias Thorne, who waited for the official transcript expecting the clean lines of legal procedure without the mess of human doubt. Thorne would not ask about the fog, nor would he ask about the scent. Elias turned left. The decision felt like a betrayal, yet it was the only one available. He could not follow her home. He could not knock on the door and ask for the truth. He could only write it down in the black book, in the cipher that no one else could read. The fog thickened as he walked, wrapping around his legs, muffling the sound of his boots. Behind him, the city continued its nightly routine, indifferent to the injustice settling like soot on the rooftops. He reached for his notebook, then stopped. Not here. Not on the street. He walked faster, his steps falling in time with the ticking of the court clock that still echoed in his memory. Tick-tock, tick-tock. While each stride carried him further from the verdict, it drew him nearer to the truth he now carried alone. The fog pressed in, dampening the world and twisting London's familiar streets into a labyrinth of grey uncertainty. Somewhere ahead, Mrs. Bartlett was arriving at her house, stepping onto her own pavement before unlocking her own door. Behind him, the Old Bailey stood dark and silent, its records sealed and its justice served. Elias touched his pocket one last time, ensuring the lace was safe. He would write more tonight. He would fill pages with what he knew, with what he smelled, with what he saw in the empty eyes of the acquitted. Let Thorne warn him. Let the police dismiss him. Let the crowd cheer for a fiction. He had the vapor. He had the scent. And in the quiet of his room, with the gaslight low and the door locked, he would make sure that at least one record remained unburned. The street narrowed ahead, the buildings leaning in as if to conspire. Elias walked into the darkness, the sweet smell rising again, a constant companion in the silent night, guiding him home to the page where the real trial would begin. The key stuck in the lock. Brass grated against brass, a dry, scraping sound that echoed too loudly in the empty street. Elias twisted his wrist, forcing the mechanism until the tumblers clicked with a reluctant snap. He pushed the door open. The hallway smelled of boiled cabbage and wet wool, a scent that had soaked into the plaster over decades, impervious to soap or scrubbing. Mrs. Gable stood at the foot of the stairs. She held his valise open on the banister post, her fingers digging into the leather handle as if she meant to strangle it. 2 shirts lay crumpled on the runner, collars stained with ink. She did not look up when he entered, though her shoulders tightened, pulling the black fabric of her dress taut across her back. "You are later than expected, Mr. Thorne." The court ran long. It always does when guilt is dressed in silk. She kicked at one of the shirts, nudging it towards his boots. "I received a visitor this afternoon, a gentleman from your firm." Elias closed the door. The latch clicked, sealing them in the dim gaslight. "Mr. Henderson." He did not give a name. He asked about your character, about your habits. Mrs. Gable finally turned. Her face was a map of hard lines, eyes sharp as broken glass. He wished to know if a woman lodging alone might be safe under a roof shared with a man who counts murderers among his acquaintances. "I count no one among my acquaintances. I record their words." Words have weight. She stepped down from the bottom stair, invading his space. She smelled of peppermint and coal dust. They leave marks. This trial, it has brought a certain element to the neighborhood. Loiterers, reporters, men who look at the windows. "I pay my rent." In gold, she spat the word. "But coin does not scrub the soot from a reputation. I have written to your employers. I felt it my duty." Elias felt the cold seep through his boots. The threat hung in the air, heavier than the fog outside. If Henderson believed the landlady's account, his position at the clerk's table would vanish. Silas Thorne would not defend him. Thorne cared only for the integrity of the record, not the man who scratched it down. "You packed my bags. I prepared you for departure, should the letter bear fruit." She gestured to the valise, a final dismissal hanging in the gesture. "But you are here now. The rent is paid until Saturday. I will not have you turning this house into a salon for suffragists or poisoners." "There are no suffragists here, Mrs. Gable." "There is a woman who killed her husband and walked free." Her voice dropped, a harsh whisper that scraped against the silence of the hall. "And a man who watched it happen and did nothing. That makes you complicit, in the eyes of God, if not the law." She turned back to the stairs, her skirt swishing against the wood. "Leave the bags," Elias said. She paused, one hand on the newel post. "Do not mistake my patience for kindness, Mr. Thorne. I guard this house. I guard the girls upstairs. If you bring scandal through that door, I will throw your books into the street myself." "They are only paper." "They are lies." She ascended the first step, then stopped, looking down at him with a pity that strung more than her anger. "You think you are keeping a record. You are only keeping a secret, and secrets rot, Mr. Thorne. They eat the floorboards from beneath you." She continued up, the gas jet flickering as she passed, casting her shadow long across the walls. It stretched towards him, a dark finger pointing at his chest, before vanishing around the landing. Elias stood alone in the hallway. The silence returned, but it was not empty. It was filled with the ticking of the hall clock, a mechanical heartbeat counting down the days until Saturday. He bent down, picked up the shirts, folded them with precise, stiff movements, aligning the collars, smoothing the creases. The ink stains remained. He placed them back in the valise. He did not close the lid. Walking past the stairs, he felt the weight of the house settling around him. The timber groaned, a pipe clanked in the wall. Mrs. Gable's door remained shut, but he could hear the scratch of a pen behind it. She was writing still, adding codicils, ensuring the record was correct. He entered his room. The fire had gone out. Ash lay cold in the grate, a grey powder mirroring the fog outside. He lit the gas jet on the desk, turning the valve until the mantle hissed and bloomed into a sickly yellow glow. The room expanded, shadows retreating into the corners where the wallpaper peeled in long, sunburnt strips. On the desk lay the black notebook. It sat closed, unassuming, bound in cheap cloth that had darkened with the oil from his hands. Beside it lay the official transcript pages, neatly stacked, tied with red tape. The Crown's version, the clean lines, the sanitized truth. Elias sat. The chair creaked under his weight. He rubbed his eyes, the skin feeling rough and dry. His fingers hovered over the black book. He could open it. He could read the cipher he had devised, the slanted shorthand that looked like spider legs to the untrained eye. He could see the notes on the smell of almonds, the tremor in Mrs. Bartlett's hand, the way Clark had paused before the final question. But Mrs. Gable's words echoed in the small room. Secrets rot. He looked at the fireplace. The grate was empty, ready to receive fuel or ash. Outside, a hansom cab rattled over the cobbles, the wheels iron-shod and loud, fading quickly into the distance. London moved on. The trial was over. The verdict was printed in the morning papers. Ad A tilde copyright lay tilde de Bartlett was free. Thomas Bartlett was dead. And Elias Thorne was a man sitting in a cold room with a book that could destroy him. He reached for the matchbox, struck one. The sulfur flared, bright and sudden, smelling of hellfire. He held the flame over the black book. The heat kissed his knuckles. He watched the paper edge curl, blacken, begin to smoke. Not all of it, never all of it, but enough. The flame trembled in his hand. He thought of Elias Thorne, redacting the blunders. He thought of Mrs. Gable, writing her letters. Everyone was editing the world to suit their comfort. Why should he be different? He lowered the match. Not yet. First he had to read. He had to know exactly what he was sacrificing. He opened the book. The pages whispered, dry and brittle. The cipher swam before his eyes, a code of guilt and observation that no jury would ever hear. He traced the line where he had written about the handkerchief, the scent that was not there, according to the analysts, the scent that was everything, according to him. The gas jet hissed. A draft slipped under the door, carrying the smell of cabbage from the hallway. He turned the page. The ink seemed fresh, wet though it had dried weeks ago. He read the words he had sworn to keep. And then he reached for the matches again. The flame danced, a tiny orange tongue licking at the darkness of the room before he lowered it to the page. He did not burn the book, not yet. The match hissed out between his fingers, stinging the skin, and he dropped the charred stick into the cold grate where it joined the grey dust of dead fires. To destroy the whole thing would be a lie, and Elias Thorne had spent 3 weeks choking on lies until his throat tasted of copper and old pennies. He needed to see the specific treachery again. He needed to measure the weight of the ash before he committed it to the air. His finger traced the cipher. April 18th, 4:12 p.m., the handkerchief. The shorthand spikes and loops looked like a field of wheat flattened by a storm, beautiful only to the eye that knew how to read the wind. He translated the symbols in his head, hearing the scratch of his own nib from days prior, the frantic urgency of a man trying to catch a ghost before it slipped through the courtroom floorboards. He had written that she held the linen to her nose. Not once, twice. Once when the analyst spoke of volatility, and again when Sir Edward Clark asked if she loved her husband. A reflex, a scent memory triggered by the word chloroform, or perhaps the scent itself clinging to the fabric she had brought into court as evidence of her innocence. The analysts found none in the stomach. The defense proved the bottle was for cleaning paint. The jury believed the gap between the bottle and the body was too wide to bridge with suspicion alone. But the nose remembers what the stomach digests. Elias turned the page. The paper crackled, dry and brittle as an autumn leaf crushed under a boot heel. Here in the margins he had sketched the shape of her paws, not a hesitation of thought, but a physical arresting of breath, the way a bird freezes when a shadow passes over the garden. He had noted the tightening of her gloved fingers around the railing of the dock, the white knuckles showing through the kid leather like bones pressing against skin. He had written down the smell that was not in the evidence bag, the sweet, cloying odor that had drifted across the well of the court when she unfolded the cloth, an odor that made Elias Thorne wrinkle his nose and look away, pretending to adjust his spectacles. It was all there, the unspoken testimony, the truth that lived in the gap between the question and the answer. A floorboard creaked above him. Mrs. Gable was pacing. Her steps were heavy, deliberate, marking time until the eviction or the letter or the ruin of them all. She believed secrets rotted the floorboards. She was wrong. Secrets were the only thing holding the house up. Without them, the walls would collapse under the weight of what people actually knew about one another. He looked at the official transcript beside the book. The red tape bound it tight, a neat package of sanitized history ready for the archives. In those pages, Mrs. Bartlett was a grieving widow confused by science. In these pages, she was a woman who knew exactly how much vapor it took to stop a heart without leaving a bruise. Two histories, both written by the same hand, both claiming to be the record of the Crown. Which one was the lie? The gas jet above the desk sputtered. The pressure in the mains was dropping as the city settled into night, the flame shrinking to a blue, starving cone that cast long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper. The room grew colder. The chill seeped through his trousers, settling in the marrow of his knees, a physical reminder of the April damp that no fire could ever truly beat back. He rubbed his hands together, the friction generating a fleeting warmth that vanished the moment he stopped moving. He picked up the matchbox again. It felt light, insubstantial. A cardboard tray holding 20 tiny sticks of sulfur and wood, each one capable of erasing a line of text, a paragraph, a page. He struck another. The flare was violent, sudden, illuminating the room with a harsh white brilliance that stripped away the shadows for a fraction of a second before settling back into the yellow glow. He held it over the page with the handkerchief note. The heat radiated against his thumb. If he burned it, the scent disappeared. The pause became a trick of the light. The tightening of the glove became a nervous habit of a frightened woman. The dual narrative collapsed into a single, clean line that matched the verdict. Not guilty, case closed. History would record that the prosecution failed to prove administration. It would not record that the stenographer smelled the murder on the air and wrote it down in a code no one else could break. Elias Thorne would be pleased. The integrity of the record remained intact because the irregularities were never entered into the official ledger. Mrs. Gable would be satisfied, eventually, once the scandal faded and the rent continued to arrive in gold sovereigns. And Elias would sleep. He lowered the flame. The paper edge blackened. A curl of smoke rose, thin and gray, twisting in the stagnant air of the room. It smelled of burning cellulose, acrid and sharp, cutting through the lingering scent of cabbage and damp wool. He watched the black spot grow, eating the ink, consuming the cipher, turning the observation of guilt into nothing more than a hole in the page. But he did not let it catch. He blew the match out. A wisp of smoke trailed from the tip, spiraling up towards the ceiling where it joined the grime of years. He set the book flat. He took a pen from the holder, dipped it into the inkwell, and wiped the nib on the rim until it was clean, free of excess fluid that might blot. He would not burn the truth, not entirely. To destroy it was to admit fear, to admit that Mrs. Gable's threat held power over the sanctity of the record. Instead, he would obscure it. He would add a layer of cipher over the cipher, a second skin of notation that made the text unreadable even to himself without a key he would never write down. He would bury the scent under a mountain of procedural detail, notes on the judge's cough, the time the clock struck, the color of the barrister's wig. He would drown the murder in minutiae, until it was impossible to find without drowning alongside it. The pen touched the paper. The nib scratched, a dry, rasping sound that filled the silence of the room. He wrote a new line over the old one, a dense thicket of symbols that meant nothing to anyone but him, a wall built brick by brick around the dangerous core of what he knew. The scent was present, the scent was present, the scent was present. He wrote it until the ink pooled, until the words were illegible, until the truth was hidden beneath a stain of blackness that looked like an accident, a spill, a moment of carelessness. Outside, the fog pressed against the windowpane, a thick, woolly blanket that muffled the sounds of the street and turned the gas lamps into hazy, orange ghosts. London was disappearing. The city was erasing itself, block by block, street by street, just as he was erasing the line between innocence and guilt. He capped the pen. The click of the metal lid was loud in the quiet room. He looked at the fireplace. The grate waited. The ash waited. The decision hung in the air, heavier than the smoke, heavier than the fog. He could still burn it. He could still throw the book into the cold iron jaws of the grate and watch the pages curl and blacken until nothing remained but dust. He reached for the book. His fingers brushed the cloth cover, feeling the texture of the cheap material, the wear of his own hands upon it. He lifted it. It was light, barely any weight at all for such a heavy thing. He stood up. The chair scraped against the floorboards, a harsh shriek that made him wince. He walked to the fireplace, the book held loosely in his hand, hovering over the empty grate. The darkness of the chimney yawned below, ready to swallow the secret hole. He tightened his grip. The cloth crinkled. One motion, that was all it took. A drop of the hand, a release of the fingers, and the truth would fall into the dark, joining the cold ash and the dead fire, gone forever from the world of men. He raised his arm. The muscles in his shoulder tensed. The book tipped forward, the pages fluttering open one last time to catch the yellow light of the gas jet. And then he stopped. His hand hovered in the air, trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer physical effort of holding back the inevitable. The book hung there, suspended between the desk and the grate, between the record and the ruin. He could not do it, not yet. He lowered the book back to the desk. The cover made a soft thud against the wood. He sat down, he picked up the matchbox, he struck a match. This time he did not hesitate. He touched the flame to the corner of the page where the scent was written. The paper caught instantly, the fire racing along the edge, hungry and bright, consuming the ink, the cipher, the truth, turning it all into ash that drifted up the chimney and out into the foggy night, where it mixed with the soot of 1,000 other lies and vanished into the silent, swallowing dark. Dust motes danced in the shaft of pale light that pierced the high, grimy window of court number 1, swirling in a slow, aimless vortex above the empty dock. Silence, not the hushed, expectant quiet of a trial in progress, nor the relieved exhale of a verdict delivered, but a heavy, suffocating stillness that seemed to press against the eardrums like deep water. Weeks had passed since Mrs. Bartlett had stood there, her black silk dress absorbing the gaslight, her face a mask of unreadable composure, while Sir Edward Clark dismantled the Crown's case with the precision of a surgeon separating nerve from bone. Now, the wood of the dock bore only the faint, ghostly scratches of where her hands might have rested, marks invisible to anyone who had not spent hours staring at them, willing the grain to reveal a confession it would never yield. I stepped onto the floorboards, the soles of my boots making no sound against the polished oak. The air smelled of stale tobacco, old wool, and the sharp, metallic tang of dried ink, an olfactory trace of the law that lingered long after the lawyers had departed for their clubs and the judges had returned to their chambers. It was April, yet the room felt trapped in a perpetual winter, the gas jets unlit, the heavy curtains drawn against a spring sun that offered little warmth to the stone walls of the Old Bailey. "You find it quieter than you remembered, Mr. Thorne." The voice came from the shadows near the judge's bench, dry and brittle as parchment. Elias Thorne emerged, his figure tall and angular, draped in a frock coat that seemed too large for his shrinking frame. He held a bundle of papers in one hand, the official transcript of the Bartlett trial, bound in red tape and sealed with wax that gleamed dull in the half-light. He did not smile. He rarely did. His eyes, pale and watery, fixed on me with an expression that hovered somewhere between approval and suspicion, as if he were calculating whether I posed a threat to the tidy narrative contained within those pages. "Quiet enough to hear the dust settling, Mr. Thorne," I replied, my own voice sounding strangely loud in the vastness of the chamber. "It feels as though the walls are holding their breath." "Walls do not breathe, Elias, they merely endure." He stepped closer, the heels of his boots clicking sharply against the floor, a rhythmic counterpoint to the silence. "Unlike us, we are fragile, prone to remembering things that are best forgotten, prone to writing them down in margins where they do not belong." He stopped beside me, looking down at the empty dock. His grip on the transcript tightened, the knuckles whitening beneath the thin skin of his hand. "This record is complete, clean. It reflects exactly what was spoken, nothing more. The prosecution failed to prove administration. The defense exposed the scientific impossibility. The jury acquitted. That is the history. Anything else is speculation, dangerous speculation." "And if speculation is all that remains of the truth?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could check it, driven by the ghost of the black notebook now reduced to ash in my grate at Bloomsbury. "If the truth lies in what was not said, in the spaces between the words." Silas turned his head slowly, his gaze locking onto mine. There was no anger in his eyes, only a weary resignation, the look of a man who has spent a lifetime sweeping dirt under carpet and knows the mound is growing too high to hide. "Then let it remain in the spaces, Elias. The law has no mechanism for measuring silence. It cannot weigh a vapor. It cannot indict a suspicion. To attempt to do so is to undermine the very foundation upon which we stand." He extended the bundle of papers towards me. "Take this, the final copy. It is to be archived this afternoon. Ensure no further annotations are made. Your shorthand is unparalleled, but your discretion must match it. Mrs. Gable's concerns have been noted by your employers. It would be a pity if a woman of your talents found herself without a position due to a lack of feminine propriety." The threat hung in the air, casual yet lethal, delivered with the same dispassionate tone one might use to comment on the weather. Mrs. Gable, her letters had flown then. The landlady's moral crusade against my presence in this masculine sphere had reached its destination, aided perhaps by the very man standing before me, who valued the reputation of the court above the integrity of the individual serving it. "I understand," I said, taking the papers. They felt heavy, weighted with the finality of a closed door. "The record is safe." "See that it remains so." Silas nodded, a brief, jerky motion. "Good day, Mr. Thorne." He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing until he disappeared into the corridor, leaving me alone once more with the dust and the silence. I looked down at the transcript in my hands, the red tape stark against the cream paper. Inside, every word spoken in this room was preserved, every objection, every ruling, every flourish of Sir Edward Clarke's rhetoric. But the truther, the cold, chemical scent of chloroform that had haunted my dreams, the calculated stillness of Mrs. Bartlett's eyes when the verdict was read, the impossible mechanics of a murder without a marker, none of that existed here. It was gone, burned to ash, scattered into the London fog. I walked towards the great doors of the court, pushing them open to reveal the street beyond. The contrast was immediate, jarring. The grey gloom of the interior gave way to a blinding burst of sunlight that illuminated the soot-stained brickwork of the Old Bailey and the bustling life of Ludgate Hill. A flower seller stood on the pavement, her cart overflowing with daffodils and hyacinths, their bright yellow and purple heads nodding in the breeze, vibrant and indifferent to the drama that had unfolded mere yards away. Life marched on. The city did not pause for guilt or innocence. It simply consumed both and moved forward. I stepped onto the pavement, the noise of the trafficker hooves clattering on cobblestones, the shouted instructions of cab drivers, the rumble of omnibuses washing over me. I clutched the transcript to my chest, feeling the hard edge of the boards against my ribs. It was done. The case was closed. The woman was free, and I was the sole keeper of a secret that I had chosen to destroy, a ghost story that would never be told. Back in my lodgings, the room was dim, the curtains drawn against the afternoon glare. I sat at my desk, the transcript placed neatly in the center of the blotter. Beside it lay my journal, the leather cover worn smooth by my hands. I opened it to the final page. The paper was blank, white and waiting. I dipped my pen into the inkwell, the nib hovering over the surface, poised to commit one last thought to permanence. But no words came. What was there to write? The law had spoken. The science had failed. The silence had won. To write the truth now would be an act of vanity, a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaos that refused to be ordered. Some things were too heavy for ink. Some truths were better left as vapor, invisible and intangible, drifting through the cracks of history until they dissipated entirely. I capped the pen. The click was final. I closed the journal. The sound of the cover shutting echoed in the quiet room, a small, definitive end to a long, troubled chapter. I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the street below where the gas lamps were beginning to flicker into life as the daylight faded. Soon, the crier would come to extinguish the last lights in the court, plunging the empty chamber into darkness, sealing the dock, the bench, and the memory of Mrs. Bartlett in the blackness where they belonged. Justice had been served, or perhaps it had merely been performed. The distinction, like the method of the murder itself, remained lost in the silent, swallowing dark. The nib scratched, a dry, rasping sound that tore the quiet of the room like a fingernail dragged across slate. I pressed harder, forcing ink into the fiber, but the page remained stubbornly, accusingly white. Nothing came. My hand hovered, trembling not from fatigue, but from a sudden, hollow paralysis that had seized the muscles of my forearm, turning the pen into a dead weight I could neither lift nor drop. The blotter before me held the official transcript, bound in its stiff red tape, a monument to what had been said, while the journal lay open beside it, a gaping mouth waiting for what had been felt, for the sour taste of fear that had coated my tongue every time Mrs. Bartlett adjusted her veil, for the way Sir Edward Clarke's voice had dropped an octave when he spoke of domestic devotion, a calculated modulation designed to soothe the juror's prejudices rather than address the chemistry of death. I pushed the chair back. The legs shrieked against the floorboards, a sharp protest that made me flinch. Outside, the light was failing. The gas lamps on the street below did not flare instantly, but woke slowly, their mantles glowing a sickly yellow as the daylight bled away into the soot-stained brickwork of Bloomsbury. I walked to the window and pressed my palm against the cold glass, watching the shadows lengthen across the pavement where a newsboy shouted the evening headlines, his voice thin and reedy in the cooling air, selling a version of events that was already hardening into public fact, a neat narrative of widowhood and injustice that required no further questioning. Mrs. Gable's footsteps sounded on the stairs, heavy, deliberate. She was coming to check the coal, or perhaps to see if I had finally packed my bags, her campaign against my presence having reached its fever pitch now that the trial was concluded and I remained, a stain on the respectability of her boarding house. The handle turned. I did not move away from the window. "Mr. Thorne," her voice filtered through the wood, muffled yet sharp with disapproval. "The lampman will be along directly. Shall I tell him to leave your globe alight, or are you retiring with the chickens?" "Leave it," I called back, my own voice sounding strange to me, stripped of the authority I wielded in the court when capturing the Lord Chief Justice's rulings. "I have work to finish." "A woman's work is never done, they say," she muttered, though loud enough for me to hear the edge of it, the specific bitterness reserved for those who stepped outside their ordained sphere. But a man who writes until his eyes bleed is merely avoiding the world outside his door. "Mrs. Pratchett in number 4 says you burned something in the grate last night, smelled of sulphur and lies." She did not wait for a reply. The footsteps retreated, leaving me alone again with the silence and the blank page. Sulphur and lies. She was closer to the truth than she knew, though she would never understand the chemistry of it, the way a secret could burn so hot it consumed the very paper it was written on, leaving only ash that smelled of nothing at all. I turned back to the desk and looked at the journal one last time. The blankness seemed to expand, pushing against the edges of the leather cover, demanding a confession I could not give, a verdict I had no power to deliver. To write it down would be to make it real. To fix the fluid uncertainty of that week in the rigid ink of permanence would be to accuse a woman the law had declared innocent, to stand against the combined weight of the bench, the bar, and the public opinion that had rallied around the grieving widow with such fervent, misguided chivalry. And yet to leave it blank was to acquit her myself, to become complicit in the silence that had swallowed Thomas Bartlett whole, a silence so complete it had left no mark upon his throat, no stain upon his lips, only the faint, sweet odor of chloroform that lingered in my memory like a ghost refusing to be exorcised. I picked up the pen again. The inkwell reflected the flickering gaslight, a dark pool of potential judgment. I touched the nib to the paper, intending to write a single word, just one, to anchor the truth before I let it go. Chloroform, or perhaps impossible, or guilty. The nib snagged on a rough patch of pulp, a blot of ink spread, ugly and black, blooming like a bruise on the white surface. I stared at it, watching it soak into the fibers, irreversible and final. It looked like a mistake. It looked like the end of an argument. It looked like nothing at all. I set the pen down. The decision was not made in a flash of insight or a surge of moral courage, but in a slow, grinding resignation that settled in my bones, heavy and cold. The truth was not a thing to be captured in shorthand, not a series of symbols that could be transcribed and archived. It was a vapor. It was the space between the question and the answer, the hesitation in a witness's voice, the way a woman's hands remained perfectly still while the world crumbled around her. It could not be held, it could only be witnessed and then released. I took the journal and closed it. The leather creaked, a sound of old age and finality. I ran my hand over the cover, feeling the worn smoothness where my thumb had rested during those long days in court number 1, tracing the contours of a story that would now remain untold. Then I lifted the book and placed it in the top drawer of my desk, beneath a stack of unused ledgers and dried-out inkwells, burying it under the detritus of a profession that demanded fidelity to words, but offered no sanctuary for truth. A knock came at the door, softer this time. "Mr. Thorne, the lampman is here. He says the pressure is low in the main, might be a dim light tonight." "Let him come," I said. "It matters little." The door opened, and a man in a soot-stained cap entered, carrying a long pole with a hook at the end. He moved to the gasolier, twisting the valve and applying a taper to the mantle. The light flared, casting long, dancing shadows against the peeling wallpaper, illuminating the dust motes that swirled in the air like tiny, frantic spirits. He adjusted the flame, turned, and nodded to me before slipping back out into the hall, leaving the room bathed in a wavering, uncertain glow. I walked to the window again. Down on the street, the fog was rolling in from the river, a thick, yellow-gray blanket that muffled the sound of the carriages and obscured the faces of the passers-by. It was the same fog that had shrouded the Old Bailey all those weeks ago, the same fog that had hidden Mrs. Bartlett as she stepped out of the dock and into the freedom of a city that would never know what she had done. Somewhere in the distance, the clock of St. Sepulchre's began to chime. 1, 2, 3. The sound was dull, absorbed by the mist. I turned away from the window and walked to the fireplace. The grate held the cold ashes of my black notebook, the remnants of the private record I had kept, now scattered and dead. I poked at them with the iron, watching the grey dust swirl and settle. There was nothing left to burn, nothing left to say. The case was closed. The record was safe. And I was alone with the silence, a silence that was no longer empty, but filled with the weight of everything I had chosen not to write, a heavy, invisible burden that I would carry until my own final verdict was read. I blew out the candle on my desk. The room plunged into shadow, lit only by the erratic flare of the gasolier above. I sat back in my chair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for the darkness to take the rest. The gasolier hissed, a thin, serpentine sound that cut through the heavy air of the room, the mantle glowing with a sickly, wavering blue before settling into a harsh white glare that made the dust motes dance like agitated spirits. "Pressure's up then," I said, my voice sounding flat against the peeling wallpaper. The lampman did not answer. He had already gone, his boots thudding softly down the corridor, leaving me alone with the sudden, aggressive brightness that stripped the shadows from the corners and exposed the grime on the windowpane. It was too much light. It felt like an interrogation. I squinted, raising a hand to shield my eyes, the sudden illumination making the ash in the grate look less like the remnants of a secret and more like common household refuse, grey and meaningless. I stood up, The chair scraped against the floorboards, a harsh, grating noise that seemed to tear the quietude of the evening. My legs felt stiff, the blood sluggish after hours of sitting still, weighing the same thought over and over until it had worn a groove in my mind. I walked to the desk and looked down at the closed journal, the black leather cover absorbing the new light, looking dull and inert. It was just a book, a collection of paper bound in skin, nothing more. Yet it held the weight of a life, or perhaps the absence of one, the space where a truth should have been but wasn't, a void shaped like a woman's silence. I picked it up. It was heavier than I remembered, the weight of the unused pages pressing against my palm, a physical burden of all the words I had refused to write. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the texture of the cover, the slight roughness where the binding had been stressed by my own nervous fingers during those long days in court. Then I opened it. The pages rustled, a dry, whispering sound, flipping past the coded shorthand of April, past the frantic scrawls of May, until I reached the end. The final page was blank, a stark, white rectangle staring back at me, demanding a conclusion I could not provide. I ran my thumb over the empty space. The paper was smooth, cold, unblemished by ink or doubt. It waited, it always waited, but there was nothing to put there, no verdict, no confession, no final judgment that could bridge the gap between what the law had decided and what I knew in the quiet of my own skull. The law had spoken. Mrs. Bartlett was free. The record was sealed. To write anything else now would be an act of vanity, a desperate attempt to impose order on a chaos that refused to be ordered, to find a pattern in the smoke that had already dissipated into the London air. I closed the book again. The snap of the cover was final, a small, sharp sound that echoed in the room. I placed it back in the drawer, pushing it deep into the darkness beneath the ledgers, burying it under the weight of my professional life, hiding it away where no one would ever find it, where it could rot in peace along with the secrets it contained. I slid the drawer shut. The wood clicked into place. "Done," I whispered. The word hung in the air for a moment, then vanished, absorbed by the thick fog that pressed against the glass. I turned away from the desk and walked to the door, my footsteps heavy on the floorboards. I needed to leave. The room felt too small, the air too thick with the smell of burnt paper and stale tobacco, the atmosphere of a tomb where I had buried something that should have remained alive. I grabbed my hat from the stand, the felt rough under my fingers, and pulled it low over my eyes, shielding myself from the harsh glare of the gaslight. Outside, the street was a different world. The fog had thickened, rolling down from the river in dense, yellow-gray waves that swallowed the gas lamps whole, leaving only faint, haloed ghosts of light to guide the way. The air was cold, damp, clinging to my skin like a wet wool blanket, carrying the scent of coal smoke and wet horse manure, the familiar, comforting stench of London in spring. I pulled my coat tighter around me, buttoning it up to my chin, and stepped out onto the pavement. The stones were slick with moisture, reflecting the dim light in shimmering, distorted patches that looked like oil on water. I walked. There was no destination, only the need to move, to put distance between myself and the room where I had made my choice. My boots clicked on the wet stones, a rhythmic, solitary sound that kept time with my thoughts. 1 step, 2 steps. The fog muffled the city, dampening the rumble of distant carriages, the shout of a newsboy, the clatter of hooves, wrapping everything in a woolly silence that made me feel as though I were walking through a dream, or perhaps a memory that was already fading. Near the corner of Great Russell Street, a patch of color caught my eye. A flower seller, huddled against the damp, had set up a small basket on the curb, the blooms bright and defiant against the soot-stained brick of the building behind her. Primroses, pale yellow and soft white, trembling slightly in the damp air, their petals delicate and fragile, yet alive. I stopped. The contrast was shocking, a violent clash between the vibrancy of life and the grey monotony of the street, a reminder that the world continued to turn, indifferent to the dramas played out in courtrooms and boarding houses, indifferent to guilt or innocence, to life or death. "Fresh picked, sir," the woman said, her voice raspy, wrapped in a shawl that hid most of her face. "Only a penny. Cheer you up, they will." I looked at her, then at the flowers. They smelled of earth and rain, a clean, sharp scent that cut through the smog. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a coin, pressing it into her hand without speaking. She nodded, a quick, jerky movement, and offered me the basket. I took a single stem, the stalk cool and damp against my palm, and held it. It felt fragile, easily crushed, yet it stood upright, reaching for a sun that was hidden behind the clouds. "Thank you, sir," she muttered, pulling her shawl tighter. "God keep you." I walked on, the flower in my hand. I did not know what to do with it. It seemed absurd to carry a primrose through the foggy streets of Bloomsbury, a trivial object in a world of heavy consequences. But I held it anyway, gripping the stem tightly, feeling the slight resistance of the fibers, the life pulsing within the green stalk. It was a small thing, an insignificant thing, yet it was real. It existed. Unlike the truth of the Bartlett case, which had slipped through my fingers like water, leaving only a damp stain on my conscience. The fog swirled around me, thickening as I approached the junction, obscuring the path ahead, turning the familiar streets into a labyrinth of grey shadows and faint lights. I paused at the crossroads, looking left, then right, the direction meaningless in the gloom. It did not matter where I went. The outcome was the same. The record was safe. The woman was free. And I was just a man walking in the fog, holding a flower that would soon wilt, carrying a silence that would never break. I took a step forward into the mist. The gas lamp above flickered, the flame dancing wildly in the draught, then sputtered and died, plunging the corner into darkness. I did not stop. I kept walking, the yellow of the primrose a faint, dying star in my hand, guiding me into the void. The Silent Vapour is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Pimlico Mystery. Edward Clarke, barrister. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.